Good evening, and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. In the middle of the 12th century, two of the most powerful kings in Europe gathered their armies, said their prayers, and marched toward the Holy Land with absolute certainty that God was on their side. They came back having achieved almost nothing, having lost tens of thousands of men, having embarrassed themselves in front of the entire medieval world, and having somehow managed to make the situation in the Middle East considerably worse than when they found it. This is the story of the Second Crusade, and it is one of history's most spectacular, most human, and most painfully relatable failures. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world before the Second Crusade. What the First Crusade left behind. To understand why the Second Crusade happened, you need to understand what the First Crusade actually created, and what it created was complicated. Deeply, messily, structurally complicated in the way that only medieval politics can be. Cast your mind back to 1099. After 3 years of extraordinary violence, starvation, religious fervour, political manoeuvring, and more than a few moments that can only be described as sheer insane luck, the armies of the First Crusade had done the impossible. They had marched from Western Europe all the way to Jerusalem, fought their way through Anatolia, survived sieges and ambushes and disease, and internal arguments that would have destroyed most modern institutions, and captured the Holy City. Jerusalem, the spiritual centre of the Christian world, the place where Christ had walked and suffered and died, was in Christian hands for the first time since the Arab conquest of 637. The reaction in Europe was one of stunned, joyful disbelief. People genuinely could not believe it had worked. The chroniclers who recorded the event did so in language that trembled with religious awe. God had intervened. The impossible had happened. Christianity had reclaimed its most sacred site. But here is the thing about capturing a city that sits in the middle of a region where you're vastly outnumbered by people who very much want it back. You then have to hold it, and holding it turned out to be a rather different challenge than taking it. The Crusaders who remained in the East after the First Crusade established what historians call the Crusader States. There were 4 of them. The County of Edessa, established in 1098 in what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, was the first and in many ways the most precarious. The Principality of Antioch, carved out of the great ancient city of the same name in northern Syria, was the second. The County of Tripoli, established along the Lebanese coast, was the third, and at the heart of it all the Kingdom of Jerusalem, stretching from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, covering the territory that today encompasses Israel, the Palestinian territories, and parts of Jordan, was the 4th and most prestigious. These states were not small. Together they covered an enormous amount of territory, but they were also islands in a sea of Muslim-held land, and the people who governed them were working with a fundamental problem that no amount of military skill or political cunning could entirely solve. There were never enough of them. The population of these Crusader states was made up of a relatively small Frankish ruling class sitting atop a much larger population of local Christians, Muslims and Jews. The Franks, as the Muslim sources generally called all Western Crusaders regardless of their actual origin, had brought with them the feudal structures of Western Europe. They built castles, they established lordships, they created courts and councils and all the bureaucratic machinery of medieval governance. They intermarried, to varying degrees, with the local Christian population. Over time, a generation grew up who had never seen Europe, who spoke Arabic alongside French, who adapted their diet and their dress and their architecture to the realities of life in the Levant. These were the Poulains, as later chroniclers called them, the locally born Franks, and they developed a pragmatic understanding of their situation that sometimes put them at odds with the fresh waves of crusaders who periodically arrived from the west full of enthusiasm and righteous fury, and a deeply inconvenient desire to attack everyone immediately. The first generation of rulers had been extraordinary figures. Godfrey of Bouillon, who refused the title of king because he would not wear a crown of gold in the city, where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, governed Jerusalem briefly before his death in 1100. His brother Baldwin I took the title without such scruples, and proved himself one of the most capable rulers the kingdom ever had. Baldwin expanded the kingdom's territory, fought off Egyptian attacks, established diplomatic relationships with the Venetians and Genoese whose maritime power was essential for supplying the coastal cities, and generally gave the young state the firm foundation it needed to survive. His cousin Baldwin II, who succeeded him, continued this work, and it was during Baldwin II's reign that the military orders were established. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 by a French knight named Hugh of Paynes, were initially a small group of men who dedicated themselves to protecting pilgrims travelling the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. They established their headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, which the Crusaders had converted into a palace, and which they believed sat on the site of Solomon's Temple, hence the name. Within a few decades, with the backing of Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote their rule and championed their cause with his characteristic passionate intensity, the Templars had become one of the most formidable military forces in the medieval world. The Knights Hospitaller were older, having originated as a charitable organisation caring for sick pilgrims, but they too militarised during this period, adding armed protection to their charitable mission and becoming alongside the Templars the backbone of the Crusader military. So the infrastructure was there, the castles were there, the military orders were there, the administrative system was there. What was perpetually, chronically, existentially lacking was manpower. The Crusader states needed a constant flow of settlers, soldiers, and resources from the west. The sea lanes connecting them to Europe were vital. The Italian merchant cities of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa provided not only the ships but the commercial networks that kept the ports functioning. In exchange, they received extraordinary privileges: trading posts, reduced tariffs, entire quarters of cities where they governed themselves under their own laws. The Muslim world surrounding the Crusader states was not, in the decades immediately following the First Crusade, a unified threat. This is important to understand. The reason the First Crusade had succeeded as spectacularly as it had was in large part because the Muslim world was deeply divided. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was a shadow of its former self, its caliphs reduced to ceremonial figureheads while real power lay with the Seljuk Turks. But the Seljuk Turks were themselves divided into competing sultanates, none of which was willing to subordinate itself to another long enough to mount a coordinated response to the invaders from the west. And then there were the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, Shia Muslims who regarded the Sunni Seljuks with as much hostility as they regarded the Crusaders, and who had actually made tentative approaches to the Crusaders before the First Crusade, hoping to use them against their mutual enemies. This fragmentation was the Crusaders' greatest strategic asset. As long as the Muslim world remained divided, the Crusader states could survive by playing one faction against another, signing treaties with one emirate to counter another, and exploiting the gaps between competing powers. But fragmentation was not a permanent condition. History has a way of producing men who impose unity by sheer force of will and military brilliance. And in the first half of the 12th century, such a man was beginning to emerge in the Syrian city of Mosul. His name was Imad ad-Din Zengi, and he would change everything. Before we get to Zengi, though, it is worth taking a moment to appreciate just how strange and fascinating the society of the Crusader states had become by the 1130s and 1140s. These were not simply European colonies transplanted wholesale into the Middle East. They were hybrid societies that had evolved in response to their environment in ways that would have bewildered the original Crusaders. The Frankish nobles who ruled the great castles of Outremer, as the Crusaders' eastern territories were collectively known, lived lives that in many respects resembled those of their counterparts in France, or England, or Germany. They held courts, they administered justice, they collected tolls and taxes, they attended Mass and observed the Christian calendar, but they also lived in houses designed for the Middle Eastern climate, with courtyard gardens and fountains. They ate food seasoned with spices that would have been exotic luxuries back home. They wore lighter clothing suited to the heat. Many of them spoke Arabic. Some had Muslim servants and advisors. A few, to the horror of visiting Western clergy, had adopted the Arab custom of the bath, which the Church viewed with deep suspicion as a gateway to all manner of wickedness. The relationships between the Frankish ruling class and the local population were complex. In the countryside, Muslim and Christian peasants often worked the same land under Frankish lords. In the cities, Muslim merchants traded alongside Christian ones. There was violence and oppression, certainly, as there is in any colonial structure. But there was also a degree of coexistence that would have surprised the chroniclers of the First Crusade, who had written of the conflict in purely apocalyptic terms of total war between faiths. The Church was a constant presence. Jerusalem itself had been transformed into a Christian city of extraordinary religious intensity. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, rebuilt and expanded by the Crusaders, was the most sacred site in the Christian world. Pilgrims came in their thousands, travelling dangerous roads and dangerous seas to pray at the tomb of Christ. The city was full of monks, priests, bishops, and the complicated ecclesiastical bureaucracy that the medieval church brought with it everywhere it went. It was, in short, a world that had achieved a kind of equilibrium, fragile, contested, dependent on conditions that could not last forever, but functional. A world that had learned to survive. And then came Zengi, Edessa Falls. The spark that lit the fire. Imad ad-Din Zengi was not, by any reasonable measure, a good man. The Arabic sources that record his career are full of his cruelties, his casual violence, his absolute willingness to execute subordinates who displeased him in even minor ways, his ferocious and unpredictable temper. He was feared by his own troops as much as by his enemies, which is a significant achievement in its own grim way. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but so entirely consistent with everything else we know about him that it hardly matters whether it literally happened, that he once had a soldier crucified for the offence of urinating in his garden, not attacking his garden, not stealing from it, urinating near it. He was not, to put it mildly, someone whose bad side you wanted to find yourself on. But here is the thing about Zengi that makes him historically interesting rather than merely unpleasant. He was also a military and political genius of the First Order, genuinely, the kind of mind that appears in a given era and reshapes it simply by being better at the fundamental business of power than everyone around him. And in the fragmented, politically chaotic, constantly shifting world of 12th century Syria and northern Iraq, that kind of genius combined with that kind of ruthlessness was not merely effective, it was transformative. He was born around 1085, the son of a Turkish governor of Aleppo named Aksunkur. His father's story is itself a small lesson in the violence of the age. Aksunkur was executed when Zengi was still a young child, killed in the relentless political turbulence of the Seljuk world. The boy was taken in and raised in the household of Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Kerboga was the man whose enormous army had arrived to besiege the Crusaders at Antioch in 1098, trapping them inside the city they had just barely captured, and who had then been defeated in the engagement outside the city walls in what the Crusaders had fervently and sincerely interpreted as a miraculous divine intervention. Kerboga himself had not survived long after that defeat, and so the young Zengi grew up in the household of a man whose military reputation had been defined by one of the First Crusade's most celebrated moments. He learned the politics and military arts of the Seljuk world from inside that specific shadow, watching carefully how power was accumulated, exercised, lost, and sometimes violently taken away. He was appointed governor of Basra in 1122 by the Seljuk Sultan, then governor of Mosul in 1127, a promotion that gave him control of one of the strategically most important cities in northern Mesopotamia. Mosul sat at a junction of trade routes and military corridors that made whoever controlled it a significant regional power. Zengi understood this immediately. He was not a man who received authority and sat comfortably inside its existing boundaries. From Mosul, he began the patient, systematic, relentless work of expansion. He took Aleppo in 1128, creating a power base that straddled northern Syria and northern Iraq in a way that no single ruler had managed for decades. He fought the Crusaders when it served his purposes, he fought rival Muslim rulers when it served his purposes, he fought the Artukid dynasty to his north. He fought more or less everyone, more or less constantly, and he won more often than he lost, which in the medieval Middle East meant that his power grew and his rivals shrank. The Crusaders were not ignorant of Zengi. They had been clashing with him throughout the 1130s, and they understood well enough that he represented a different kind of threat from the fragmented, competing Muslim rulers they had been managing for decades. In 1137 and 1138, the Byzantine Emperor John II Komnenos had led a major campaign into the region, attempting to reassert Byzantine authority over the Principality of Antioch and reminding the Crusaders that their overlordship of the area was contested from the north as well as threatened from the east. The Crusaders had watched the complicated triangular tension between Constantinople, their own states, and Zengi's expanding power with the anxiety of people who understood that any significant shift in the regional balance could be catastrophic. They were islands of Christian power in a sea that was steadily becoming more unified and more purposeful around them. The County of Edessa, the northernmost and in many ways the most structurally vulnerable of the four Crusader states, occupied an especially precarious position in this landscape. Edessa itself is the modern city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, sitting in the upper Mesopotamian plain where the geography offers few natural defences and many natural invasion routes. The county had been established in 1098 by Baldwin I, the man who would later become the first king of Jerusalem, who had seized it from its Armenian Christian ruler in circumstances that the various medieval sources describe with a diplomatic vagueness that suggests everyone involved understood it did not reflect especially well on Baldwin. The details of how exactly the transfer of power happened vary enough between accounts that historians have been arguing about it ever since, and the truth is probably not entirely comfortable for the Crusader side of the story. What is clear is that Edessa was, structurally and geographically, a nightmare to defend. It was an inland county with no coastline, no access to the sea, no convenient supply line from the Italian merchant cities whose ships kept the coastal Crusader states functioning. It had no mountain ranges providing natural barriers, no great rivers creating defensible lines. It was surrounded on three sides by Muslim-held territory. Its survival depended entirely on two things: the military competence of whoever was governing it, and the willingness of its neighbours, both Christian and Muslim, to maintain working relationships that kept the worst pressures at bay. Remove either of those conditions and the county became, almost immediately, untenable. By 1144 both conditions had been compromised. The man governing the county was Jocelyn II, and the portrait of him that emerges from the medieval sources is not a flattering one. He is described repeatedly as ineffective, indolent, more absorbed in the comforts of court life than in the unglamorous work of maintaining fortifications, training garrisons, and managing the diplomatic relationships that kept the county from being picked off by its neighbours. Whether this portrait is entirely accurate is a legitimate question. Medieval chroniclers had strong opinions, limited impartiality, and a tendency to explain military disasters through the moral failures of the people responsible, because moral failure was a satisfying explanation that fit their theological worldview. It is entirely possible that Jocelyn was a more capable man than the sources suggest, and that he was simply overwhelmed by circumstances that would have defeated anyone, but the evidence does seem to support at least the outline of the criticism. The fortifications of the county had been allowed to deteriorate. The garrison was thin. The relationships with neighbouring rulers, including Raymond of Antioch to the south, had broken down badly enough that Jocelyn could not count on ready assistance in a crisis. And then, in the autumn of 1144, Jocelyn made the decision that turned a chronic vulnerability into an acute catastrophe. He took the majority of his military forces south to assist Raymond of Antioch in some military operation, leaving Edessa itself defended by a skeleton garrison. Zengi was watching. He had been watching for years, probing at the edges of Edessa's defences, testing its responses, identifying exactly where and when the moment of maximum vulnerability would arrive. When Jocelyn rode south with his army, that moment had arrived. He moved with the speed that defined all his best campaigns. Speed was one of Zengi's most consistent military virtues. He understood that the advantage of surprise and momentum was worth more than the advantage of overwhelming numbers, and he combined both whenever he could. In late November, 1144, his army materialized before the walls of Edessa with a suddenness that the defenders found deeply disorienting. The Count was absent. The garrison was a fraction of what it should have been. The civilian population, predominantly Armenian Christians who had been living in and around the city for generations, was doing its best to organize a defense under circumstances that grew more desperate by the hour. Zengi's engineers were among the finest practitioners of their craft in the Islamic world, and siege warfare in the 12th century was fundamentally an engineering problem. The question of whether a fortified city could be taken was largely a question of whether the attacking force had the technical expertise and the material resources to solve specific physical challenges, undermining walls, breaching gates, suppressing defenders on the battlements long enough to get men over or through them. Zengi had those resources and that expertise. His sappers began mining operations almost immediately, digging tunnels beneath the ancient foundations of Edessa's walls and shoring the tunnels with wooden props that would eventually be burned. It was patient, methodical, technically demanding work. When the props burned, the tunnels would collapse and the stone above them would come down. The siege lasted less than a month. On Christmas Eve, 1144, the fires were set and the mines were fired. A section of the wall came down, Zengi's troops surged through the breach in the darkness and the cold of a winter night, and the city of Edessa, the first of the Crusader States to have been established 46 years earlier, the oldest Christian political entity in the East, fell. The night that followed was terrible in the way that all medieval city stormings were terrible. Fighting in the narrow streets, civilians caught between the attackers pressing inward and the defenders trying to hold what they could. The Armenian Christian population suffered badly, caught in a catastrophe that was not of their making. The Latin clergy were killed. The cathedral was looted. Jocelyn II, racing back from the south with a relief force the moment news reached him, arrived to find the city already firmly in Zengi's hands and his force entirely insufficient to retake it. Zengi was, by the brutal standards of 12th century siege warfare, relatively restrained once the immediate violence of the storming had subsided. He allowed the Armenian Christian population to remain in the city. He restored order. He did not pursue a policy of systematic massacre. This was not mercy for its own sake, it was pragmatism. Zengi wanted a functioning city, a productive city, a city that would serve as a base for further operations. A city depopulated by slaughter was an asset transformed into a liability, and Zengi did not waste assets. None of this restraint, genuine and pragmatic as it was, softened the impact of what had happened in any way that mattered to the Christian world. News of the fall of Edessa reached Europe in early 1145, carried by a series of letters and most dramatically by the Bishop of Jabala, a Syrian prelate who travelled personally to the papal court to deliver his report face to face. Otto of Freising, the meticulous and thoughtful chronicler who was present at court when the bishop arrived, recorded the scene. The bishop wept as he spoke. The assembled clergy and nobles sat in silence as the full dimensions of the catastrophe were laid out before them. The oldest Crusader state was gone. The eastern frontier of Christendom had been broken. If Edessa could fall in less than a month to a single besieging force, what did that say about the security of the other states? What did it say about Antioch? What did it say about Jerusalem? Otto wrote that the mood in that room was one of profound and terrible grief. He was not exaggerating for rhetorical effect. He was describing what he had witnessed. And then, as grief reliably does when it moves through the corridors of power, it began slowly to change its shape. It began to harden into something more purposeful. The weeping in the papal court was entirely genuine, but weeping was not a policy, and the fall of Edessa demanded a policy. The grief was real, and out of it, in the weeks and months that followed, something else began to grow. Zengi himself did not live to see the full consequences of what he had set in motion. In September 1146, he was assassinated in his own tent by one of his own servants, stabbed while he slept during a military campaign. The details in the sources are ignominious. He had been drinking. He had threatened the servant earlier in the evening. This servant, apparently calculating that a preemptive solution to the problem of Zengi's anger was preferable to waiting for the axe to fall in the morning, decided to act first. It was an undignified death for a man who had carved an empire through military brilliance and sheer ferocity of will, and it is hard not to notice the grim irony that the man who had terrified an entire region into submission was ultimately killed by someone he had frightened just a little too effectively. His son Nur ad-Din inherited his territories, his ambitions, and his strategic understanding that Muslim unity against the Crusaders was both necessary and achievable. But Nur ad-Din brought something to that inheritance that his father had largely lacked. He brought genuine religious conviction. Where Zengi had used the language of jihad as a useful political tool, Nur ad-Din believed it. He was a man of serious personal piety, and the jihad against the Crusaders was for him not a slogan, but a sacred obligation. This made him, in the long run, considerably more dangerous than his father had ever been. Zengi had been a brilliant opportunist. Nur ad-Din was a true believer with an opportunist's tactical mind. But that story belongs to later chapters. In 1145, what mattered was the fall of Edessa, the shockwave it had sent through the Christian world, and the response it was about to provoke in Rome. That response was going to change everything. The Pope speaks, quantum predecessors and the call to arms. The Pope who received the news of Edessa's fall was Eugenius III, and if you have not heard much about Eugenius III, do not feel embarrassed about that, because you are in good company. He spent most of his pontificate being comprehensively overshadowed by the man he appointed to preach the crusade on his behalf, the extraordinary and rather exhausting Bernard of Clairvaux. History has a habit of doing this. It remembers the brilliant, charismatic figure who stood in the field and moved crowds to tears, and it quietly sidelines the careful, sincere administrator who organized everything from a desk. Eugenius was the desk man, Bernard was the field man, and history, as it almost always does, remembered the field man. This is probably unfair to Eugenius, who was a capable and genuinely devout person, doing his level best in circumstances that would have broken a less committed man. He had been elected pope in February 1145, which was approximately 2 months after the fall of Edessa, though the news of the city's fall had not yet made its way to Rome when the cardinals cast their votes. He was a Cistercian monk, which meant he came from the same austere, reform-minded monastic tradition that had produced Bernard of Clairvaux. He was, in fact, Bernard's former pupil, which would prove to be both an advantage and a complication as the crusade took shape. His election had been something of a surprise, including apparently to himself. He had been elevated from a relatively modest ecclesiastical position, and he found himself almost immediately confronting a political situation in Rome that was, to put it with maximum gentleness, not what a new pope needed. Rome in the 1140s was in open civic upheaval. A reformer named Arnold of Brescia, a charismatic and theologically unconventional figure who had been condemned by Bernard and was regarded by the church establishment as deeply dangerous, had inspired the establishment of a commune in the city. This was a popular government that directly challenged both the Pope's temporal authority over Rome and the power of the Roman nobility, who had traditionally managed the city's political life on the church's behalf. The commune declared that the Pope should be a spiritual leader and nothing more, that temporal governance of the city belonged to the Roman people, and that the old arrangements were finished. Eugenius did not accept this argument. He also, at this particular moment, lacked the military force to do anything decisive about it. He was forced to leave Rome almost immediately after his election, conducting his entire pontificate from various locations across Italy and France, governing the universal church from a series of temporary residences, because the city that was theoretically the seat of that church was in the hands of people who did not want him there. This is not, it must be said, the ideal administrative position from which to organize a major military expedition to the other side of the known world. The Pope trying to launch a crusade while simultaneously being unable to live in his own capital is the kind of detail that does not make it into the inspiring sermons, but does a great deal to explain why the Crusade's early organization was somewhat patchy. But Eugenius was a man of genuine conviction, and the fall of Edessa demanded a response that went beyond what any administrative difficulty could excuse. The oldest of the Crusader states had been swallowed by the enemy. The eastern frontier of Christendom had collapsed. The letters arriving from the survivors in the east described horrors, massacres, churches desecrated, bishops killed or enslaved, the faithful scattered. In December 1145, Eugenius issued a papal bull, a formal document carrying the full weight of papal authority, addressed to Louis VII of France and to the assembled princes and people of that kingdom. He titled it Quantum Predecessores, which translates roughly as How Much Our Predecessors Laboured, and in that title you can already see the rhetorical strategy at work. The document was a carefully constructed piece of persuasive writing. It began by summoning the memory of the First Crusade and the heroic deeds of the men who had gone before, their sacrifices, their victories, the extraordinary achievement of taking Jerusalem against all odds. This was a deliberate and sophisticated appeal to the medieval instinct for ancestral honour, which ran extremely deep. In a culture where your family's reputation was one of your most important possessions, where the deeds of your grandfather reflected on you as surely as your own actions, being reminded that your ancestors had done something glorious and being asked whether you intended to honour that legacy was not a neutral observation. It was a challenge that most medieval nobles felt in their bones. From ancestral honour, the bull moved to present horror. The church built in honour of the Virgin Mary at Edessa had been converted into a mosque, it said. The bishops of the city had been killed or carried away into slavery. Christians were being enslaved and slaughtered. The land consecrated by the blood of the early martyrs, one of the oldest Christian communities on earth, was now in the hands of the enemy. The language was chosen to wound, and it did. And then came the offer. Those who took the cross, who committed themselves to the crusade, would receive a plenary indulgence. This meant a full remission of the penance owed for all their confessed sins. Their families would be under the protection of the church while they were away. Their debts would be suspended. They would march under the direct patronage of God himself. To a modern reader, this might sound like a transaction, which in some theological sense it was. But it is worth pausing to understand what it meant to a medieval Christian, for whom all of this was not metaphor but literal reality. These were people who lived with a constant and serious awareness of sin and its consequences. The theology of purgatory, the place where souls were purified of the stain of sin before they could enter heaven, was not an abstraction or a distant concern. It was a practical fact of spiritual life that shaped decisions, motivated charitable donations, filled monasteries with prayers for the dead, and generated an enormous amount of genuine anxiety about the state of one's soul. The length of purgatorial suffering was proportional to the sins accumulated in life. A crusade indulgence offered something extraordinary. It offered to wipe the ledger clean, go to the Holy Land, fight for God, and come home as if all of it had never happened. For people who genuinely believed this, and most of them did, the offer was extraordinary. There was, however, a problem with the initial reception of the bull, and the problem was simple and somewhat deflating. Nobody paid much attention to it. Louis VII of France, to whom the document was primarily addressed, had been independently thinking about some form of armed pilgrimage to the East, for reasons rooted in his own specific spiritual crisis. He had been entangled in a violent dispute with the town of Vitry-en-Perthois, in which the town's church had been burned, and with it perhaps 1,000 people who had taken shelter inside. The deaths of those people sat heavily on Louis's conscience. He was, among his other qualities, a genuinely pious man, pious in a way that was sometimes inconvenient for his effectiveness as a king, but that was completely sincere. The idea of a penitential pilgrimage to Jerusalem had already been floated at his court as a way of addressing the spiritual weight of the Vitry catastrophe. But when Louis raised the possibility of a crusade at his Christmas court at Bourges in December 1145, the assembled nobles and clergy received the idea with the enthusiasm of people being asked to volunteer for something extremely expensive, extremely dangerous, and not obviously in their immediate interest. His nobles were not keen. The influential Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, one of the shrewdest political minds in France, had significant reservations and made them known. The general feeling in the room was that the project was enormous, the objectives were unclear, the costs were prohibitive, and perhaps someone else could deal with it. Eugenius reissued the bull in March 1146, with some additional provisions clarifying the privileges and protections on offer, and with one crucial new element. He asked Bernard of Clairvaux to preach the crusade in person. This decision would change everything. But before we arrive at Bernard and the remarkable events at Vézelay, it is worth taking a moment to look at the political map of Europe in 1146, because the Second Crusade was not born into a stable world with surplus energy to direct toward distant enterprises. It was born into a continent that was already managing several serious crises simultaneously, and persuading its rulers to add another enormous commitment to that list required something considerably more powerful than a papal letter, however well written. The Holy Roman Empire, the sprawling collection of German, Austrian and North Italian territories that constituted the most powerful political entity in Western Europe, was being governed by Conrad III. Conrad had come to the throne through a contested election, and had spent much of his reign managing an ongoing conflict with the Welf dynasty, specifically with Henry the Black and then his son Henry the Lion, who commanded enormous resources and had never fully accepted the legitimacy of Conrad's rule. The German princes who followed Conrad were not eager to abandon their local power struggles in order to march to the other end of the world. They had enough politics to manage at home. In France, Louis VII was young, genuinely earnest, deeply religious, and still relatively inexperienced in the full weight of kingship. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, completed in 1137 when both of them were teenagers, had brought him the enormous and strategically vital Duchy of Aquitaine as a dowry, which was the good news. The less straightforward news was that Eleanor was a woman of exceptional intelligence, formidable personal will, and a fierce independent identity rooted in her own duchy, that she was never entirely willing to subordinate to her role as Queen of France. Their marriage was not a simple hierarchy. It was a negotiation, sometimes a tense one, and it coloured the political atmosphere of the French court in ways that mattered. In England, King Stephen was fighting the civil war known as the Anarchy, the grinding, exhausting, devastating conflict over the succession between his own supporters and those of his cousin Matilda. He was not going anywhere. England was fully occupied with itself. In the Iberian Peninsula, the situation was different in an interesting way. Alfonso VII of Castile and Leon, Alfonso I of Portugal, and Ramon Berenguer, the Fourth of Aragon and Barcelona, were all actively campaigning against the Almohad Empire that controlled the southern portion of the peninsula. They were already, in a meaningful sense, fighting their own crusade. The Reconquista was not a metaphor or a distant aspiration for these kings. It was the central military reality of their reigns, one that was geographically immediate and practically urgent in a way that a campaign in the Levant was not. So the landscape into which Eugenius was trying to launch his crusade was a landscape of distracted, overextended rulers dealing with immediate, concrete local crises, none of whom had obvious reasons to enthusiastically commit themselves to an enormously expensive and logistically terrifying adventure in the Middle East. The papal bull had been issued, the call had been made, the theological machinery was in place, the indulgence was on the table. What was missing was the figure who could make people feel, in their bones, in the deepest and most inaccessible part of their conscience, that they had no choice but to go. That figure was on his way. He was small, he was thin, he was chronically unwell in ways that would have confined a less determined man to his bed for most of the year. He was the abbot of a Cistercian monastery in Burgundy, which is not a position that obviously qualifies a person to mobilize the military forces of Western Europe, and he was about to talk an entire continent into a war. Bernard of Clairvaux, the man who talked Europe into a war. Let us be clear about something from the outset. Bernard of Clairvaux was not a warrior. He was not a politician, at least not in the conventional sense. He was a monk, the abbot of the Cistercian monastery at Clairvaux in Burgundy, a man who had entered religious life young and devoted himself to it with an intensity that bordered on the terrifying. He fasted so severely that he permanently damaged his digestion. He drove himself and the monks under his care with a spiritual rigour that would have broken less committed men. He was thin, often ill, frequently exhausted, and yet, when Bernard opened his mouth, people listened. When Bernard wrote a letter, people obeyed. When Bernard decided that something needed to happen, it had a way of happening. He was, by any measure, one of the most influential figures of the 12th century, a man whose moral authority was so vast that popes sought his approval and kings trembled at his reproach. He had already demonstrated this influence in spectacular fashion during the papal schism of 1130, when he had championed the cause of Pope Innocent II against the anti-pope Anacletus II with such energy and persuasive force that he had essentially determined the outcome. He had travelled across Europe, writing letters, preaching sermons, meeting kings and nobles and clergy, building a coalition of support that gradually isolated Anacletus and secured Innocent's victory. It was a campaign that revealed Bernard as perhaps the most effective political operative in Europe, working entirely through the medium of moral persuasion. He was also, it should be said, deeply controversial. He had launched ferocious intellectual attacks against Peter Abelard, the great philosopher and theologian, pursuing him with a relentlessness that strikes modern readers as something close to persecution. He had strong opinions, expressed them without restraint, and was not especially interested in the feelings of those who disagreed with him. But his sincerity was never in doubt. Bernard genuinely believed everything he said, including the things that made life difficult for people who crossed him. When Eugenius III, his former pupil, asked him to preach the crusade, Bernard initially hesitated. He was not a military man. He was not sure the crusade was the right response to the situation. He had concerns, which he expressed in his characteristically forthright way in correspondence with the Pope. But Eugenius insisted, and Bernard accepted, and once Bernard accepted something, he did not do it halfway. The first great public event of Bernard's crusade preaching was the assembly at Vézelay in Burgundy on March 31st, 1146. The date was Palm Sunday, and the symbolism was deliberate. Palm Sunday was the day commemorating Christ's entry into Jerusalem, the holy city that Christians were now being called to defend. The assembly was enormous. People had come from across France, drawn by the combination of Bernard's reputation and the gravity of the occasion. The crowds were so large that the church could not hold them all, and a wooden platform was erected outside in a field so that Bernard could address the multitude in the open air. Louis VII was there, along with Eleanor of Aquitaine and the great nobles of France. The king had already taken the cross privately, committing himself to the crusade, and now he was presenting that commitment publicly to his assembled subjects. Bernard's sermon at Vézelay is not preserved in full. What we have are descriptions of it from contemporaries, and those descriptions are remarkable. Bernard spoke, and people wept. Bernard spoke, and men who had come as skeptics left as crusaders. The crowd surged forward demanding crosses, the cloth crosses that crusaders sewed to their garments as a sign of their commitment. Bernard ran out of pre-made crosses. He reportedly tore his own robe into strips to make more, and when those were gone, people tore their own clothing to fashion crosses for themselves and their neighbours. It was, by all accounts, one of the great moments of medieval public rhetoric. Something happened at Vézelay that transcended politics and calculation, and touched something deeper in the assembled crowd. Whether you interpret that something as the working of the Holy Spirit, as Bernard undoubtedly did, or as the product of an extraordinarily skilled orator working on an audience already primed by guilt, grief, and religious anxiety, the result was the same. France was in the Crusade. Bernard then embarked on an extraordinary preaching tour through France, the Low Countries, and the Rhineland, travelling through the winter of 1146 and 1147, covering enormous distances and speaking to crowds wherever he went. His letters from this period describe a kind of rolling religious revival. Towns were emptied of men. Villages became the domains of women and old men as their husbands and sons and fathers took the cross. The response exceeded anything that had been planned or anticipated. It also produced a side effect that Bernard had not intended and found deeply troubling. A monk named Rudolf, inspired by Bernard's preaching but apparently having taken its logic in a rather different direction, began preaching against the Jews of the Rhineland. His argument was simple and terrible. Why go all the way to the Holy Land to fight the enemies of Christ when there were enemies of Christ living right here, in the cities of the Rhine? The result was a wave of anti-Jewish violence along the Rhine. Jewish communities in Mainz, Cologne, Worms and other cities were attacked. People were killed. The echoes of the First Crusade, during which Jewish communities along the Rhine had also been massacred by crusading mobs in 1096, were horrifying. Bernard reacted with genuine fury. He wrote letters condemning the violence in the strongest possible terms. He travelled to the Rhineland personally to counter Rudolf's preaching. He made it absolutely clear that the crusade was not a license to attack Jews, that Jewish people were not to be harmed, that Rudolf was a dangerous fool whose ideas were contrary to Christian teaching. His intervention was partially successful in stopping the immediate violence, though not before significant harm had been done. This episode is important not just as a historical footnote, but as a window into the complex and sometimes terrifying dynamics of crusade preaching. When you told people that there were enemies of Christ who needed to be dealt with, you could not always control which enemies they decided to deal with first. Meanwhile, Bernard turned his attention to the German territories and to Conrad III. This was a harder sell. Conrad had good reasons to stay home. His kingdom was not stable. His relationship with the Welf dynasty was not resolved. He had, when first approached about the crusade, declined politely but firmly. He had, it is fair to say, no particular desire to go. Bernard met with Conrad at Speyer in late December 1146. The German king had still not committed to the crusade. Bernard preached to him. The sermon he gave is described by Otto of Freising, who was present and who was Conrad's own half-brother, and the description is remarkable. Bernard structured his sermon as if God himself were speaking to Conrad directly, addressing the king and asking him to account for what he had done with the gifts God had bestowed upon him. "What will you say on the day of judgment?" Bernard asked. "When you are asked what you did when the holy places were threatened and you had the power to act." Conrad wept. Conrad took the cross. Bernard wrote afterward to the Pope with the kind of quiet satisfaction of a man who had just accomplished something he was rather pleased about. The King of Germany was in the crusade. How did Bernard do it? How did one monk, however eloquent, however morally formidable, talk two of the most powerful kings in Europe into mounting the most expensive and logistically complicated military operation available to the medieval world? Part of the answer is Bernard himself, his extraordinary personal authority and rhetorical gift. Part of it is the political context. Both Louis and Conrad had reasons rooted in their own situations for wanting to go. Part of it is the genuine religious power of the crusade idea, the indulgence, the call to honour one's ancestors, the deep emotional charge of Jerusalem, and part of it, if we are being honest, is the medieval equivalent of peer pressure. Once Louis was in, the French nobles had to decide whether they were less courageous, less pious than their king. Once Conrad was in, the German princes faced the same calculation. Nobody wanted to be the man who stayed home while the great adventure of the age went forward without him. By the spring of 1147, the Second Crusade was not merely planned, it was an overwhelming reality. 2 royal armies were being assembled. The logistics of supplying and moving them were being worked out with varying degrees of success. arrangements were being made with the Byzantines for passage through their territory. The machinery of medieval crusading was grinding into motion, and nobody, not Bernard, not Eugenius, not Louis, not Conrad, had any real idea of how badly it was going to go. The kings prepare, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. To march an army from Western Europe to the Holy Land in the 12th century was an undertaking of such staggering complexity that it is almost surprising it worked as well as it did the first time. The First Crusade had stumbled toward its extraordinary success through a specific and unrepeatable combination of factors. Military skill, certainly, political luck in abundance, religious fervour that sustained men through hardships that should by rights have broken them long before they reached Jerusalem, and perhaps most critically, the fortunate accident that the Muslim world of 1097 was so deeply divided against itself that it could not mount a coordinated response to the invasion until it was too late. The Second Crusade would have none of that luck. It would have significantly less unity, and it was marching into a Muslim world that had spent 50 years studying the Crusaders and learning exactly how to fight them. But in the spring of 1147, none of that was apparent yet. What was apparent was that two royal armies were being assembled, that the Pope had given his blessing, that Bernard of Clairvaux had done the seemingly impossible and talked two reluctant kings into the enterprise, and that the most powerful military forces in Western Europe were preparing to march east under the banner of God. The confidence was genuine, the preparation was serious, and the men who rode out from their castles and monasteries and market towns in those early summer months had every reason, by the logic of their world and their faith, to believe they were going to succeed. Let us begin with Louis VII of France, because he is in many ways the more sympathetic of the two royal commanders at the heart of this story. Sympathetic is not the same as effective, and it is important to hold that distinction clearly, but sympathy matters when we are trying to understand what drove these people and how they made their decisions. Louis had been born in 1120, the second son of King Louis VI of France. That detail is important. He had not been raised to be king. He had been intended for the church, educated in monasteries, shaped from childhood by a religious sensibility that was entirely genuine and that never left him, not even after his elder brother died in a riding accident in 1131, and Louis found himself suddenly heir to the throne. He was pious in the way that some people are musical, not as a skill they have learned, but as a fundamental quality of how they perceive the world. Mass was not an obligation for Louis. It was nourishment. Prayer was not performance. It was conversation. This made him, in certain respects, a remarkable human being. It also made him, in certain respects, a frustrating king. Genuine piety of that depth tends to produce men who are kind, patient, forgiving, and reluctant to act with the ruthless decisiveness that medieval kingship regularly required. Louis was, to put it plainly in the language of a later era, a genuinely nice man who had been given a job that required someone at least occasionally capable of being rather less nice. The gap between those two things would shape his entire reign, and it would shape the Second Crusade in ways both subtle and catastrophic. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, arranged in 1137 when both of them were teenagers, had brought the French crown an enormous political prize in the form of Eleanor's vast duchy in southwestern France. Aquitaine was wealthy, strategically important and culturally distinctive, and Eleanor was its duchess in her own right, not merely by courtesy of her husband's position. The marriage had produced two daughters by 1147, and a great deal of unresolved tension that simmered beneath the surface of the royal court. Eleanor was, by any honest assessment, Louis's superior in political intelligence and force of personality. She had a sharp, analytical mind, a fierce independence of spirit, and an attachment to Aquitaine and to her own identity as its ruler that she was never entirely willing to subordinate to her role as Queen of France. Their marriage was not a straightforward hierarchy. It was a negotiation, sometimes a strained one, and everyone at court knew it even when nobody said it aloud. Eleanor accompanied the crusade. She was not alone in this. Several other noble women also travelled with the army, a fact that would generate considerable commentary from contemporaries who felt, quite firmly, that military expeditions were no place for women. Eleanor's presence was partly a matter of her own considerable determination, and partly a matter of practical political reality. As Duchess of Aquitaine, she commanded the personal loyalty of a substantial portion of the men marching in the French army. Her presence was not merely symbolic, it was, in a medieval political sense, structural. Louis prepared for the crusade with the thorough and sincere commitment that characterized everything he did. He convened a great assembly at Vézelay in January 1147, bringing together the most important nobles and clergy of France to formally confirm the crusade and begin organizing its logistics. The gathering was impressive. The barons were there, the heads of the great monasteries were there, the machinery of French royal governance was visibly engaged with the project. The planning that followed was as thorough as the limitations of 12th century administration allowed, which is to say it was thorough in some respects and wildly optimistic in others. The army Louis assembled was substantial, though anyone who tells you a precise number is being considerably more confident than the sources justify. Medieval chroniclers were not statisticians, and their figures for army sizes tend to reflect their sense of the occasion rather than an accurate count. Modern historians working from the available evidence have suggested somewhere between 10 and 20,000 combatants, with an additional and quite uncertain number of non-combatants of various kinds. Pilgrims travelling under the Crusade's protection, servants, merchants hoping to profit from the movement of so many people, and the various other categories of person who inevitably attach themselves to any large medieval army on the move. The total number of people moving with the French force was almost certainly well above the combatant count. The planned route would take them through the Balkans, across Byzantine territory to Constantinople, then across Anatolia and south through the territories of the Crusader States to Jerusalem. It was roughly the same general path the First Crusade had taken 50 years earlier, though now with the benefit of roads, way stations and established relationships that had been built up over the intervening decades. Conrad III of Germany was a different kind of man, shaped by different circumstances, dealing with different problems and possessed of a temperament that contrasted with Louis's in almost every respect. He had come to the German throne in 1138 through a contested election, winning out over Henry the Black of the powerful Welf dynasty, in circumstances that had left the Welfs deeply unreconciled and actively dangerous. The internal politics of the Holy Roman Empire in this period were a labyrinth of dynastic ambitions, ecclesiastical rivalries, and the perpetual grinding tension between the king's centralizing impulses and the fierce autonomy jealously guarded by the princes. Conrad had been managing this labyrinth since his election with varying degrees of success, and the prospect of leaving it for a year or more to go on crusade was not one he had initially embraced. He had, as we have already seen, required the personal intervention of Bernard of Clairvaux at Speyer to tip him toward commitment. That intervention had been effective, but Conrad's commitment to the crusade was always shadowed by his awareness of what he was leaving behind. Regents would manage his kingdom in his absence. Those regents would be managing an ongoing, unresolved conflict with the Welfs. The calculation Conrad had made was that the spiritual rewards of the crusade, the papal favour it would earn, and the military prestige of a successful campaign would ultimately strengthen his position more than his absence would weaken it. It was, as calculations go, not an unreasonable one. It also proved to be entirely wrong, but you cannot always know that in advance. The German army was enormous, probably larger than the French force, though here again the sources are more enthusiastic than precise. What can be said with confidence is that it was vast, diverse and complex in ways that created serious management challenges from the very beginning. The feudal levies of the German princes formed its core, but around them clustered substantial contingents from Hungary, Bohemia, and other territories of the empire, each with its own commanders, its own supply arrangements, its own internal loyalties, and its own ideas about how the campaign should be conducted. Conrad's authority over the whole enterprise was real, but it required constant, active negotiation to maintain. This was not an army with a clean chain of command. It was a coalition, and coalitions are considerably harder to direct than armies. This brings us to the logistical problem that overshadowed every other consideration for both forces, and that problem was food. Medieval armies consumed staggering quantities of supplies. Men and horses both needed feeding every single day, and the quantities involved were not modest. Moving a force of tens of thousands of people through territories that operated on subsistence margins was a constant, grinding, genuinely frightening logistical challenge. The Byzantine Empire, through whose territory both armies would march before reaching Anatolia, was theoretically a friendly power with treaty obligations to provide markets and supply stations. In practice, as will become clear, theoretical friendship had a way of becoming considerably more complicated once the actual armies arrived. Both forces planned to cross from Constantinople into Anatolia and march southeast through territory controlled by the Sultanate of Rum, before descending into the Crusader States. It was the most direct route geographically. It was also a route that passed through the heartland of a Turkish state that had spent 50 years learning from the First Crusade's example and developing tactics specifically designed to neutralize the military advantages of heavily armored Western cavalry in open terrain. The finances of the enterprise were complex enough to deserve a moment's attention, because they tell us something about how seriously these kingdoms took the undertaking. Louis raised money through direct taxation of his subjects and through the sale of various privileges, exemptions, and rights. He borrowed heavily from barons, from monasteries, from merchants. The church contributed. The Knights Templar, who had by this point developed a sophisticated financial infrastructure alongside their military function, effectively operating as bankers with armed branches across the Mediterranean, handled some of the money transfers that allowed resources to be moved without physically carrying silver coins across dangerous roads. It was, for its time, an impressively organised financial operation. Pope Eugenius, who remained in France for much of this period, provided the spiritual and political framework that held the whole enterprise together in its public presentation. In June 1147, at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, he consecrated the oriflamme, the sacred red battle standard of the French kings, in a ceremony of considerable symbolic power. Louis received the banner kneeling at the altar, placing himself in the posture of a servant of God rather than a sovereign of men. It was beautifully staged and completely sincere. There is something genuinely affecting about those departure scenes if you let yourself sit with them for a moment, rather than rushing past them toward the disasters that followed. The farewell masses in the great churches, the nobles who distributed their valuables to monasteries and hospitals before leaving, because they were honest enough with themselves to acknowledge they might not return. The women and children standing in castle courtyards watching their fathers and husbands and sons ride away into a future that nobody could clearly see. The crusade was a vast, public, ceremonially elaborate event, but inside it were uncountable private moments of fear and love and hope and grief that left no record anywhere. Conrad's German forces departed in May 1147. Louis's French forces followed in June. Between them they represented the greatest concentration of Western military power that had been assembled since the First Crusade half a century before. They rode out with banners flying and prayers rising, and the absolute unshakable confidence of people who had been told by the greatest moral authority of their age that God was on their side. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. The road through the Balkans. Trouble before the fighting even started. Before the Crusaders came anywhere close to a Muslim soldier. Before a single sword was drawn in anger against the enemies of Christendom. Before any of the grand military objectives of the Second Crusade could even begin to be pursued, the armies of France and Germany had to cross the Byzantine Empire. And crossing the Byzantine Empire turned out to be one of the more exhausting and instructive experiences of the entire campaign. It was an exercise in controlled mutual exasperation, a slow-motion diplomatic friction that revealed with uncomfortable clarity how differently the Western Crusaders and the Eastern Romans understood their relationship with each other, what they owed each other, and what they were each actually trying to accomplish. To understand why that relationship was so difficult, you need to go back about 50 years, to the moment it was first established, because the foundation was shaky from the beginning. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had sent an embassy to Pope Urban II. His request was, by his own understanding, fairly modest. The Seljuk Turks had advanced deep into Byzantine Anatolia, seizing territory that Constantinople had held for centuries. Alexios needed military help. He wanted soldiers, mercenaries, ideally controllable ones, the kind of military force that would take orders from Byzantine commanders and operate within Byzantine strategic priorities. He was asking for a tool, not a crusade. What he got was considerably more complicated than a tool. The First Crusade had descended on Constantinople like an extremely religious, heavily armed, and thoroughly unmanageable natural disaster. The enormous Western army that arrived at his gates was not composed of mercenaries willing to serve under Byzantine command. It was composed of Western nobles, each with his own agenda, his own sense of personal honour, and his own ideas about who owned the territories they were in the process of conquering. They were intermittently polite to Alexios. They made promises to him about returning conquered territories, and they proceeded to honour those promises with the kind of flexible interpretation that Alexios found deeply unsatisfying. The Principality of Antioch, in particular, had been established by Bohemond of Taranto in direct defiance of Byzantine claims, and it had remained a source of friction between Constantinople and the Crusader States ever since. So when the Second Crusade arrived, 50 years of accumulated grievances and mutual suspicion came with it. The relationship between Constantinople and the Western Crusaders was not new. It was simply not a good one. The Byzantine Empire in 1147 was being governed by Manuel I Komnenos, the grandson of that same Alexios who had made the original appeal to Urban II. Manuel was a man of considerable intelligence, genuine military ability, and a political sophistication that sometimes operated in ways that made his Western allies feel deeply uncomfortable. He was educated, culturally flexible, personally charming when he chose to be, and entirely clear-eyed about where Byzantine interests lay. He was also dealing with a strategic situation that had almost nothing to do with the Second Crusade's objectives. At the moment the crusading armies began arriving in his territory, Manuel was in the middle of managing a serious threat from the Norman kingdom of Sicily, which was attacking Byzantine holdings in Greece. He was simultaneously conducting delicate negotiations with the Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia. Because a working relationship with the Turks served Byzantine strategic purposes, even while it horrified the Crusaders who were marching through his territory on their way to fight those same Turks. He did not especially want a massive Western army trampling through his empire, disrupting his carefully arranged diplomatic landscape, eating his subjects' food, and demanding enthusiastic support for an enterprise that was not his enterprise. This is the context in which Conrad III's German army arrived in the summer of 1147, and the context makes the subsequent difficulties considerably more understandable. The German forces were enormous. They were hungry. They were not, by any charitable assessment, uniformly well disciplined. Moving tens of thousands of people from multiple different national and cultural backgrounds through someone else's territory in the heat of a Balkan summer, dependent on local markets that were not equipped to handle demand on this scale, was always going to produce friction. What it actually produced was considerably more than friction. Soldiers looted. This was not a uniform policy, and Conrad was genuinely trying to prevent it. But when your army is hungry and the local markets have run out of food, and the man in the next village over appears to have a barn full of grain, the theological arguments against theft become somewhat abstract. There were violent incidents. Arguments with local populations that should have remained arguments turned into brawls. Brawls turned into something uglier. Markets were disrupted. Local communities that had been expecting to profit modestly from feeding a passing army found themselves instead dealing with the aftermath of something considerably more aggressive. The Byzantines responded in kind, which is to say they were not passive sufferers of Western indiscipline. Manuel's officials along the route had their own tools available. They could provide inadequate supply, slow the markets, give misleading information about distances and routes. There were allegations, probably with some basis in fact, that Byzantine guides deliberately misdirected German units, that supplies were adulterated, that locals were encouraged to harass stragglers. None of this rose to the level of open warfare, but all of it contributed to an atmosphere of mutual resentment that thickened with every mile of the march. It was, to put it plainly, the relationship of two parties who needed each other and did not much like each other, and were managing that dynamic with the minimum of grace on both sides. Conrad met with Manuel in Constantinople in September 1147. The meeting was tense but formally correct. These were kings and emperors, and they had the training and the discipline to maintain the appropriate surface even when the substance beneath was uncomfortable. Conrad was received with the elaborate Byzantine ceremonial that Western visitors always found both impressive and slightly maddening. The Byzantines had been refining their court ritual for 1,000 years. They had elevated formal ceremony to a kind of political art form, one that operated in the gap between what an action appeared to mean and what it actually implied. Whether being received in the great palace of Constantinople was an honour or an exercise in subtle condescension was precisely the kind of question that Byzantine ceremony was designed to leave answerable in multiple ways. Conrad and his battered, fractious army were ferried across the Bosphorus and into Asia Minor, with what all parties involved probably recognised as mutual relief. The Western Crusaders were astonished by Constantinople, genuinely. It was a city whose scale and wealth and sophistication had no equivalent in Western Europe, a place where the buildings were taller, the streets were busier, the markets were more full, and the accumulated weight of 1,000-year-old civilization was present in every stone and mosaic. But astonishment and admiration did not translate into goodwill, and the relief of departure was real on both sides of that famous strait. Louis VII and the French army arrived in Constantinople in October 1147, following the path the Germans had already cleared, or failed to clear depending on your assessment. Louis's personal meeting with Manuel went somewhat better than Conrad's had. Louis was, by temperament and by training, a more naturally diplomatic figure. He was a genuinely courteous man, something that the Byzantines found refreshing after Conrad's more blunt personal style. The immediate friction of Conrad's enormous, undisciplined army was also behind them now, which helped the atmosphere. But better in tone did not mean uncomplicated in substance. The two men sitting across from each other in Constantinople that autumn represented institutions with fundamentally different interests. Manuel wanted the Crusade to leave his territory as quickly as possible, to not disturb his arrangements with the Turks, and to not create new claims on Byzantine-influenced territory in Syria and Antioch. Louis wanted enthusiastic Byzantine support for a military enterprise that Manuel regarded as, at best, a distraction from his actual strategic priorities. Louis was frustrated by what he perceived as Manuel's insufficient commitment to the common Christian cause. The question he was implicitly asking was the one that many Western visitors to Constantinople asked. Why was the Emperor of the Christian East not throwing himself wholeheartedly into the defense of Christendom? The answer, which the Byzantines were perfectly capable of articulating but which Western crusaders found deeply unsatisfying, was that the Byzantine Empire had been defending the eastern frontier of Christendom for several centuries before the First Crusade had ever been preached, that it had its own strategic calculations, and that those calculations did not necessarily require it to subordinate itself to the objectives of Western kings who arrived with enormous armies, ate everybody's food, and then went home when things got difficult. Manuel also carried a specific anxiety that was not irrational given what would eventually happen. The wealth of Constantinople was visible to any Western visitor who passed through it. It was staggeringly, almost offensively visible. The palaces, the churches, the markets, the accumulated treasures of a civilization that had been gathering wealth for a millennium. Western crusaders had not always been restrained in the presence of great wealth. Manuel knew the history of his own grandfather's dealings with the First Crusade. He knew how quickly a friendly Western army could become an acquisitive one. He was not being paranoid. He was being careful. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 would prove that his caution was entirely justified when another Western army did exactly what he feared. The French army crossed into Asia Minor in the autumn of 1147. They were following the route that Conrad's Germans had already taken. They were marching east toward the Sultanate of Rum, toward the mountains and the dry plateau of Anatolia, toward everything they had come to fight for. They did not yet know what had happened to the army that had preceded them. It had in fact already been destroyed. Conrad's forces had met the Seljuk Turks in the interior of Anatolia, and what had followed was not a battle in any sense that the word usually implies. It was a catastrophe. The French army marching east in the autumn of 1147 was walking toward a landscape littered with the consequences of that catastrophe, following a road marked by the deaths of thousands of men who had set out from Germany with exactly the same confidence, exactly the same faith, exactly the same certainty that God was guiding their footsteps. The Bosphorus was behind them now. The comfortable, complicated, exasperating world of Byzantine politics was behind them. Ahead lay Anatolia, and Anatolia had not been kind to crusaders. It was not going to be kind to these ones either. Anatolia, where the crusade began to bleed. The Sultanate of Rum controlled most of Anatolia in 1147. Its capital was at Konya, in the centre of the peninsula, and its rulers had spent the decades since the First Crusade studying the military capabilities of Western armies and developing counter-strategies. They were not the same force that had faced the First Crusade. They were better organised, better informed, and better prepared. Conrad's German army had crossed into Anatolia with considerable confidence. The emperor had chosen to take the most direct route across the peninsula, following the old Roman road that ran southeast through Nicaea, to Dorylaeum, and then down toward the Crusader States. This was the same route the First Crusade had taken, and the First Crusade had taken it successfully. Conrad was perhaps insufficiently attentive to the difference in circumstances between 1097 and 1147. The Turkish forces under the Sultan of Rum, Masud I, did not confront the Crusaders in open battle. They had learned from the First Crusade not to do that. Instead, they employed the tactics that steppe cavalry were exceptionally good at: harassment, ambush, and the deliberate denial of supplies. They rode alongside the German column, picking off stragglers, attacking supply trains, destroying water sources and making it impossible for the army to forage effectively. The Anatolian plateau in late October and November was cold, dry, and largely empty. Water was scarce. Food was scarcer. Conrad's army, massive and hungry, was struggling with the logistics of moving so many people through terrain that offered so little. In late October 1147, near the site of ancient Dorylaeum, where the First Crusade had won one of its most important victories 50 years earlier, Conrad's army was attacked in force. The engagement was not a pitched battle in the conventional sense. The Turks used their mobility to surround and penetrate the German columns, launching multiple simultaneous attacks that disrupted the German formations and prevented them from bringing their heavy cavalry to bear effectively. The result was catastrophic. The German army collapsed. Thousands were killed. Many more were captured. The supply train was lost. Conrad himself was wounded in the fighting and barely escaped with a fraction of his original force. He retreated back toward the coast in disorder, his great crusading army reduced to a battered remnant. The scale of the disaster was staggering. Exact numbers are impossible to establish, but it is clear that Conrad lost the majority of his forces in this engagement and in the subsequent retreat. Men who had marched from Germany full of holy purpose and military confidence were dead in the dirt of the Anatolian plateau, killed by arrows they never saw coming from horsemen they could never quite catch. Conrad led his survivors back toward the Byzantine coast, where he eventually linked up with Louis VII's French army, which was only then beginning its own march through Anatolia. The meeting of the two kings was not a joyful reunion. Conrad was wounded, his army was shattered, and the news he brought was devastating. The route across the plateau, the most direct route to the Holy Land, was no longer viable. Louis took stock of the situation and made a decision that was probably correct given the circumstances, but that would create its own problems. Instead of attempting the inland route that had destroyed Conrad's army, the French would follow the coastal road, staying near the sea where Byzantine supply ships could in theory provide support. This was slower and involved more difficult terrain in places, but it was less exposed to the worst of the Turkish harassment tactics. The march of the French army along the Anatolian coast in the winter of 1147 to 1148 was an ordeal. The Turkish forces were not content to let the Crusaders simply walk along the coast unmolested. They continued their harassment tactics, attacking the flanks of the column, killing stragglers, destroying supplies. The French army was better disciplined than the German, and Louis was more careful in maintaining its formation. But the losses were constant, grinding, and demoralizing. The Templars, who were present in significant numbers in the French army, contributed significantly to the column's survival. Their discipline and their experience in fighting against Turkish cavalry made them valuable in the rearguard and flank protection roles that were most critical in this kind of terrain. Louis, recognizing this, reorganized his army at one point to give the Templars a central command role, which helped but did not solve the fundamental problem that the army was too large, too slow, and too dependent on a supply system that was failing. One particularly difficult episode occurred in early January 1148 near the Cadmus Mountains in southwestern Anatolia. The French vanguard, commanded by Louis's chamberlain Thierry Galleron, had moved ahead too quickly and had occupied the heights of a mountain pass. When the rest of the column came up, there was a gap between the vanguard and the main body, and the Turks exploited it mercilessly. The resulting engagement was bloody and nearly fatal. Louis himself was in the thick of the fighting, and there are accounts of him climbing a rock or a tree, clinging to it while Turks struck at him, unable to finish him because his armour was too good and his grip on the branch too determined. It is one of those images that history sometimes offers of kings in extremis, stripped of their royal dignity and fighting for their lives like any common soldier. The army extricated itself, but with significant losses. The mood in the French camp grew darker. There was also the question of supplies and Byzantine support. Manuel had promised to provide markets and supply stations along the route. In practice, the Byzantine officials along the coast were sometimes helpful and sometimes actively obstructive, depending on their local instructions and their assessment of the political situation. There were allegations that Byzantines had given Crusaders misleading directions, that they had sold them adulterated food, that they had generally failed to provide the assistance they had promised. These allegations need to be assessed carefully because the sources are not always impartial, and frustrated medieval armies had a tendency to blame their logistical failures on whoever was nearby. But it is clear that the Byzantine-Crusader relationship along the Anatolian coast was not a smooth one, and that the Crusaders arrived in the ports of southern Anatolia significantly weakened and deeply resentful of everyone they had dealt with on the journey, the decision was made to proceed to the Holy Land by sea rather than continuing the land march. Ships were hired or provided. The remaining forces, much reduced from their original strength, were loaded onto vessels and sailed south along the coast. Conrad had already made this decision. He had travelled by sea to Jerusalem, arriving ahead of the French. By the time Louis arrived, Conrad had already been in the Holy Land for some time, had received care for his wounds at Jerusalem, and had visited the holy sites. He was alive. He was still technically a crusading king, but the German army that had been such a central element of the original crusading plan was essentially gone. The two armies that arrived in the Holy Land in the spring of 1148 were not the forces that had set out from Europe with such confidence the previous year. They were remnants, battered, depleted, their morale shaken, their logistics disrupted, their commanders scarred by the experience of the march. They had not yet fought a single battle against the Muslim forces they had come to defeat, and they had already lost thousands of men. The worst of it, the thing that would haunt the chronicles and the letters and the theological reflections that followed, was not just the losses, it was the question of why. Why had God allowed this to happen? The First Crusade had been a miracle. The Second Crusade was beginning to look like a punishment. What had the Crusaders done wrong? What sin had attracted divine displeasure? The answers that contemporaries offered to these questions reveal a great deal about how medieval people understood their relationship with God and with history. Bernard of Clairvaux, sitting in Clairvaux in France, would eventually produce his own answer to that question. It was not entirely satisfying even to him, but before any of that reckoning there was still a crusade to conduct. The kings were in the Holy Land. The armies, diminished but present, were in the Holy Land. Something still had to be done, and the something that was decided upon in a council at Acre in June 1148 would prove to be the Second Crusade's definitive moment. It would not be a proud one. The Crusader States, politics, paranoia, and poor decisions. The Crusaders who arrived in the Holy Land in the spring of 1148 were stepping into a political landscape that was considerably more complicated than the simple narrative of Christians against Muslims suggested. The Crusader states had been governing themselves for nearly 50 years, and in that time they had developed their own political priorities, their own strategic calculations, and their own sometimes exasperating tendency to make decisions that made perfect sense from their local perspective and baffled everyone who arrived from the West expecting a straightforward military campaign. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was being governed in 1148 by Queen Melisende and her young son Baldwin III. Melisende was a formidable figure, one of the most politically capable rulers the kingdom ever had, and she had been effectively governing since the death of her husband Fulk of Anjou in 1143. She understood the political geography of the Holy Land better than any freshly arrived crusader, and her priorities were shaped by that understanding in ways that did not always align with the objectives of the visiting kings. The great barons of the kingdom were equally complex characters. Men like Manasses of Herge, the constable, and the leaders of the military orders had lived in Outremer for most or all of their adult lives. They understood, in a way that Louis and Conrad could not quite grasp, that any action they took in the Holy Land had consequences that would last long after the visiting crusaders had sailed home. A battle won today that left the kingdom diplomatically isolated tomorrow was not necessarily a good battle to fight. This is the fundamental tension that ran through the entire politics of the crusade in the Holy Land. The visiting crusaders wanted decisive action, a great victory that would demonstrate the power of Christendom and reverse the shame of Edessa's fall. The local lords wanted sustainable outcomes, actions that would strengthen the long-term position of the Crusader states without creating new enemies they would have to manage for the next decade. Before we get to the Great Council at Acre, we need to visit the most personally dramatic episode of the entire crusade and one of the most thoroughly gossiped about events of the 12th century. We need to talk about what happened at Antioch. Raymond of Antioch was Eleanor of Aquitaine's uncle. He was also one of the most charming, ambitious and politically shrewd figures in the Crusader states, a Poitevin noble who had come to Antioch in somewhat adventurous circumstances and had made himself its ruler through a combination of personal magnetism and strategic marriage. He was genuinely charismatic. He was also genuinely self-interested in a way that was entirely normal for a medieval lord, but that coloured everything he did. When the French army arrived at the port of Saint-Simeon near Antioch in March 1148, Raymond welcomed them with extravagant hospitality. There were feasts, entertainments, gifts. Louis and Eleanor were housed in the princely palace. Raymond was at his most charming, his most gracious. But behind the hospitality was a very specific political agenda. Raymond wanted the French army to help him attack Aleppo. More specifically, he wanted them to help him recover the County of Edessa, or at least the parts of it that could be retaken, and to extend Antioch's northern frontier against the forces of Nur ad-Din, who had inherited his father Zengi's power and was at least as dangerous. This was a reasonable military objective, arguably more strategically sensible than anything that would later be decided at Acre. Aleppo and the northern territories were where the real threat to the Crusader States originated. Addressing that threat directly made logical sense. Louis refused. His reasons for refusing are not entirely clear from the sources. Part of it was political. He had taken a vow to go to Jerusalem, and he felt that honour and piety required him to complete that journey before engaging in any military operations. Part of it was probably personal. Eleanor was very clearly enjoying herself at Raymond's court. She was reunited with her uncle, speaking the Poitevin dialect of her home region, engaging in the kind of intellectual conversation that was not always available in the more constrained atmosphere of the French royal court. She was happy in a way that made Louis uncomfortable. What happened next has been debated by historians ever since. The sources, mostly hostile to Eleanor and written well after the events they describe, suggest that Eleanor informed Louis that she wished to remain in Antioch rather than continue to Jerusalem. She may have raised the legality of their marriage, suggesting that their consanguinity, their degree of kinship, made the union canonically invalid. She may have said that she wanted to discuss this with the church authorities. The sources, characteristically, make this sound as scandalous as possible. Louis, according to the chronicler John of Salisbury, who was there at the time, had Eleanor removed from Raymond's palace at night by force. He carried her away with him when the French army departed for Jerusalem, over her explicit objections. Did Eleanor and Raymond have an affair? The sources that say so are later, mostly hostile to Eleanor, and mostly of questionable reliability. John of Salisbury, who was actually present, says nothing of the kind. What seems likely is that Eleanor was deeply unhappy with her marriage, that she found Raymond's company preferable to Louis's, and that she was willing to use whatever political and legal arguments were available to her to escape a situation she found intolerable. The affair story, whether true or not, served the political interests of those who wanted to discredit her. What is certain is that the episode left Louis deeply humiliated and deeply suspicious of his wife. It left Raymond furious and without the military support he had been counting on, and it left the French army marching south toward Jerusalem with a cloud of personal drama hanging over it that did not improve anyone's decision-making. The French and the Germans converged on Jerusalem in spring 1148. The arrival was emotionally overwhelming for most of the Crusaders. Whatever difficulties they had encountered on the road, whatever losses they had suffered, whatever personal dramas were playing out in the royal tent, the sight of Jerusalem was the moment the whole enterprise had been building toward. Men wept. They prostrated themselves. They prayed. They kissed the dust. There was also, inevitably, a great deal of political manoeuvring. Conrad and Louis met with Queen Melisande and the leading figures of the kingdom. Discussions were held about what the combined crusading force should actually do now that it was here. The options were analysed, the military situation was assessed, and then, on June 24th, 1148, the Great Council was held at Acre, and the crusade made its most fateful decision. The Siege of Damascus, the crusade's greatest blunder. The council at Acre in June 1148 is one of those historical events that historians, with the full benefit of hindsight, have been shaking their heads at ever since. It brought together the most powerful military and political figures in the crusading world. It had access to the best military intelligence available. It had theoretically the collective wisdom of men who had been managing the politics of the Middle East for decades, and the decision it reached was, by almost any measure, a catastrophically bad one. The council needed to decide what target the combined crusading forces should attack. Several options were available. The first, and perhaps most strategically obvious, was to attack Aleppo. Aleppo was the base of Nur ad-Din's power. It was the city from which the threat to the northern Crusader states originated. Attacking it would directly address the problem that had precipitated the crusade, namely the expansion of Muslim power under the Zengi family, in the region where that expansion was actually happening. Raymond of Antioch had been arguing for this approach since the French arrived at Antioch. The second option was to attempt to retake Edessa itself, or at least the eastern portion of the county that was still theoretically recoverable. This had the advantage of directly addressing the symbolic trigger of the crusade and of potentially restoring the fallen state that had shocked Christendom into action. The third option was Damascus. Damascus was then governed by a Burid dynasty that had a long history of complex and sometimes cooperative relations with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was not an ally exactly, but it was frequently a neighbour with whom the Crusader states had trading relationships, diplomatic relationships, and occasionally military understandings. The lords of Damascus had sometimes cooperated with Jerusalem against common threats. They were not friends, but they were manageable neighbours. Attacking Damascus made sense if you were primarily interested in the symbolic value of attacking an important Muslim city in the vicinity of Jerusalem. Damascus was famous, ancient, wealthy. Capturing it would be an impressive military achievement. It made much less sense if you were thinking about the long-term strategic position of the Crusader states, because Damascus was a buffer between Jerusalem and Nur ad-Din's power in the north. A hostile Damascus under Nur ad-Din was considerably worse for the Crusader states than a neutral Damascus under the Burids. The local lords of the kingdom knew this. Most of them had spent their lives managing the delicate diplomatic balance that kept Damascus neutralized. The decision to attack Damascus was not their first choice, but the crusading kings wanted action. They wanted a target that felt worthy of their effort. They wanted, frankly, something to show for the enormous expense and loss of the campaign so far. Damascus was there. Damascus was important. Attacking Damascus felt like the kind of decisive action that the crusade needed. The council voted to attack Damascus. Contemporary sources disagree about who pushed hardest for this decision. Later sources trying to explain the disaster that followed pointed fingers in various directions. Some blamed the visiting kings for overriding the wisdom of the local lords. Some blamed the local lords for agreeing to something they should have known was wrong. Some hinted darkly at treachery and bribery, suggesting that certain lords of the kingdom had been paid by the Damascenes to ensure the attack failed. These bribery accusations are almost certainly false, but they tell us a great deal about how desperate later commentators were to explain what happened. The army assembled and marched on Damascus in late July 1148. The campaign began, remarkably, with initial success. The Crusaders approached the city from the west, through orchards and gardens that provided both cover and, critically, fresh fruit and water in the summer heat. The initial advance pushed back the Damascene defenders, and the army made good progress. Damascus sent urgent messages to Nur ad-Din asking for help. This was the logical consequence of attacking the buffer state. Damascus, threatened with conquest, had no choice but to invite in the power to the north that the Crusader states had been trying to keep out. Nur ad-Din responded quickly. His forces began moving toward Damascus, and then something happened in the crusading camp that has been debated ever since. The army changed its position. Rather than maintaining the advantageous position in the orchards, the Crusaders moved to a different position on the eastern side of the city. The eastern approach was open ground without the cover and water supply of the orchards. It was a worse tactical position in almost every respect. Why did they move? The sources are unclear and contradictory. One explanation suggests that the local lords, looking at the approach of Nur ad-Din's relief force, began to calculate that if Damascus fell to the Crusaders, the city's conquest would benefit the visiting kings rather than the local nobility of Jerusalem. They may have preferred a failed siege to a successful conquest that enriched others. Another explanation suggests that the eastern position had been identified as offering access to the city walls that the western approach did not. A third suggestion, the bribery theory, has already been mentioned. Whatever the reason, the move was catastrophically wrong. The new position was exposed, waterless, and offered no tactical advantage. The army's situation deteriorated rapidly. Nur ad-Din's forces were approaching. The eastern walls of Damascus were defended strongly. The mood in the crusading camp swung from cautious optimism to desperate urgency. Within days of the camp's relocation, the decision was made to abandon the siege altogether. On July 28, 1148, the crusading army withdrew from Damascus without having achieved anything. The retreat was humiliating. Turkish cavalry harassed the withdrawing column. Men were killed during the retreat. The army that had come to the Holy Land as the greatest military force assembled in the West since the First Crusade left Damascus, having accomplished nothing beyond demonstrating that they could be made to go away. The reaction was one of utter disbelief. Conrad was furious. Louis was humiliated. The local lords of Jerusalem were left to manage the diplomatic consequences of having just attacked their most manageable Muslim neighbour and driven him into the arms of their most dangerous enemy. The whole enterprise had been a failure of such comprehensive, multi-layered incompetence that it is almost impressive in retrospect. The aftermath in Damascus itself was exactly as bad as anyone with strategic sense should have predicted. The Burid rulers, recognizing that they could no longer trust the Crusader states to respect their neutrality, moved into closer alliance with Nur ad-Din. Within a few years, Damascus would be under Nur ad-Din's control. The buffer was gone. The northern threat was now on Jerusalem's doorstep. If you were writing the history of the Second Crusade as a morality tale about the consequences of prioritizing symbolic gesture over strategic substance, Damascus is your defining example. Conrad left the Holy Land in September 1148, sailing from Acre for Constantinople. He was done, his army was gone, his ambitions were unfulfilled, and he needed to go home and deal with the wealth problem. Before he left, he had one final act of humiliation to endure. His brother-in-law Roger of Sicily, whose ships had been one of the possible sources of naval support for the Crusade, had instead used the Crusaders' absence from the west to attack Byzantine territories in Greece. Conrad had been hoping to forge an anti-Norman alliance with Manuel I Komnenos on his way home. The Byzantine emperor was not in a cooperative mood. Louis stayed in the Holy Land through the winter of 1148 and into 1149. He attended religious ceremonies, he visited holy sites. He and Eleanor continued their increasingly cold cohabitation. He participated in various minor military activities. He did not achieve anything of military significance. He finally departed in the spring of 1149. His marriage to Eleanor survived the Crusade by exactly 3 more years, dissolving in 1152 in circumstances that allowed Eleanor to remarry almost immediately to the young Henry, Duke of Normandy and future Henry II of England, a turn of events that significantly complicated the politics of Western Europe. The Great Crusade was over. The question of what it had achieved was one that its participants and their contemporaries struggled to answer honestly. The Iberian Front, the crusade nobody talks about. While Conrad and Louis were getting lost in Anatolia and making catastrophically poor decisions at Damascus, something considerably more successful was happening at the other end of the Mediterranean. In the Iberian Peninsula, a different arm of the Second Crusade was being conducted, and this one actually worked. The success of the Iberian campaign tends to get buried under the weight of the main Crusade's failure, which is a pity, because it is a fascinating story in its own right. It involves an English-led fleet, Portuguese kings, opportunistic geography, and one of the more successful examples of crusading enterprise redirected toward local political ambitions. Pope Eugenius III had been clear in his crusading call that the crusade was not limited to the Holy Land. The Reconquista, the ongoing Christian campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, was explicitly included in the crusading framework. Those who fought in Iberia would receive the same indulgences, the same spiritual rewards, the same papal protection as those who fought in the East. This was an important theological and political statement. The crusade was not just about Jerusalem. It was about the defense of Christendom wherever it was threatened. In the spring of 1147, a large fleet assembled in the ports of England and Flanders and the Lower Rhine, preparing to sail south to the Holy Land. The fleet carried crusaders from England, Flanders, Frisia, Normandy and the Rhineland, a diverse collection of northern European crusaders who were choosing the sea route to the east rather than the overland march through the Balkans. The fleet was substantial. Estimates range from perhaps 150 to 200 ships, carrying somewhere between 6,000 and 13,000 men, the sources as usual being somewhat elastic about exact numbers. It departed from Dartmouth in England in May 1147 and sailed south along the coast of France and then toward Portugal. At the mouth of the Douro River in Portugal, the fleet encountered representatives of Alfonso I of Portugal, known to history as Afonso Henriques. Afonso was a remarkable figure, the man who was in the process of carving the Kingdom of Portugal out of the Iberian Peninsula through a combination of military aggression, political cunning, and a nearly superhuman stubbornness in the face of opposition. He had proclaimed himself King of Portugal in 1139, a title that was not universally recognised, and he was engaged in continuous warfare against the Almohad Muslim forces that controlled southern Iberia. Afonso had a problem. Lisbon, one of the most important cities in his prospective kingdom, was still in Muslim hands. Taking it would require a siege force with significant naval capability, because the city sat at the mouth of the Tagus River and was accessible from the sea. Afonso had the land forces but not the naval capacity for a proper siege. and here, sailing past his coastline was exactly the naval capacity he needed. The crusading fleet stopped at Oporto, where the bishop of the city met with the fleet's leaders and asked them on behalf of Afonso to assist in the siege of Lisbon. The pitch was theological and practical in equal measure. Lisbon was a great city in the hands of the Moors. Taking it for Christ would earn the Crusaders the same spiritual rewards as anything they might do in the Holy Land. They would also receive a share of the plunder and the right to settle in the captured city. The leaders of the fleet were not unanimous. Some of the Crusaders were sceptical. They had taken their vows to go to Jerusalem, and a diversion to Lisbon was not what they had planned. Others were more pragmatic. Lisbon was closer than Jerusalem. The fighting would presumably be less horrific than Anatolia had been for the Overland Crusaders. The rewards, both spiritual and material, were concrete. After a certain amount of negotiation and debate, the majority agreed. The fleet sailed south to Lisbon, arriving in June 1147. The siege of Lisbon was, by medieval standards, a reasonably well-organised operation. The crusading fleet blockaded the river mouth, preventing supplies from reaching the city by sea. Afonso's land forces surrounded the city from the south and east. The combined force was substantial enough to make the city's position genuinely precarious. The defenders of Lisbon were experienced and determined. The city had strong walls, a capable garrison, and enough supplies to hold out for some time. The siege would last approximately 4 months. There were assaults, mining operations, the construction of siege towers, and the kind of grinding attrition that defined medieval siege warfare at its most sustained. There were also, inevitably, tensions within the besieging force. The relationship between the different national contingents of the crusading fleet was sometimes difficult. There were disputes over the distribution of spoils, there were disagreements about tactics, there was the perpetual problem of disease and supply that affected every medieval siege. But unlike Damascus, the siege of Lisbon held together. The various commanders maintained enough unity to keep the operation going. Afonso fulfilled his promises and maintained his support for the enterprise, and the defenders, after 4 months, ran out of the options that had kept them going. In October 1147, Lisbon surrendered. The conditions of the surrender guaranteed the safety of the Muslim population. Though the chroniclers note with some embarrassment that not all of the Crusaders observed these conditions, and that there was looting and violence that went beyond what Afonso had authorized, the city was handed over. Afonso claimed it. The crusading fleet had done what it came to do. The founding of the bishopric of Lisbon followed almost immediately. One of the English Crusaders, Gilbert of Hastings, was appointed the first bishop. Some of the Crusaders chose to settle in the newly conquered city rather than continuing to the Holy Land, taking advantage of the resettlement rights that had been offered. Others continued their voyage east, arriving in the Holy Land too late to participate in the Damascus campaign, but in time to hear all about it. The capture of Lisbon was genuinely significant. It gave Afonso a major port on the Tagus estuary, vastly improving his kingdom's access to maritime trade. It consolidated Portuguese control over a large stretch of the central Portuguese coast. It demonstrated that the Reconquista was a viable and rewarding enterprise for Northern European crusaders. It also, not incidentally, contributed to the historical establishment of the Kingdom of Portugal as a distinct political entity. Afonso had been using the crusade to accomplish his own territorial ambitions, and in doing so he had permanently altered the political geography of Western Iberia. This is not a criticism of him. It is simply an observation that medieval kings were very good at identifying opportunities and using them. Alongside the capture of Lisbon, other operations were being conducted in Iberia during this period. Alfonso VII of Castile was campaigning in the south. Ramon Berenguer IV of Aragon was pressing into Tortosa and Lerida, capturing both cities in 1148 with the help of crusaders from Genoa and other maritime powers. The Reconquista was making significant territorial gains across the peninsula, and the crusading framework was providing both the ideological justification and some of the additional military manpower that made those gains possible. The Iberian campaign stands as the most concretely successful element of the entire Second Crusade. Actual territory was conquered and held. Actual cities changed hands permanently. The political map of Western Europe was permanently altered. These were real achievements, durable ones that lasted not just for a season but for centuries. Contrast that with Damascus, the Northern Crusade, swords against the Slavs. There was a third theatre of the Second Crusade that receives even less attention than the Iberian campaign, and that is the northeastern campaign known to historians as the Wendish Crusade. It is a campaign that raises some of the most interesting theological and political questions of the entire crusading movement, because its targets were not Muslims but pagan Slavic peoples living in northeastern Europe, and the motivations of those who conducted it were entangled with the politics of territorial expansion in ways that are sometimes difficult to distinguish from straightforward colonialism dressed in religious language. The Wends were a group of Slavic peoples who inhabited the territories east of the Elbe River, roughly corresponding to parts of modern northeastern Germany and northwestern Poland. They were predominantly pagan, practicing a polytheistic religion that had survived the Christianization of their neighbours. They were also neighbours and frequent opponents of the Saxon nobility of northeastern Germany, with whom they had a long and violent history. When Bernard of Clairvaux was preaching the Crusade in the German territories in 1146, the Saxon nobility raised a question that was entirely predictable from people who had their own military interests to pursue. Why, they asked, should we go to the Holy Land to fight pagans when there are perfectly good pagans right here on our doorstep? Could the Crusade not be applied to the conversion of the Wends? The theological implications of this proposal were somewhat complicated. The Crusade had been framed primarily as a defensive response to the threat to the Holy Land. Applying it to offensive military action against pagan neighbours was a different kind of enterprise. Bernard initially responded that the purpose of the Crusade was to defend the Holy Land, not to conquer pagans generally. But the pressure from the Saxon nobility was persistent, and the political reality of the Crusade was that it needed the participation of those noblemen. Eugenius III issued a papal letter in April 1147, authorising the campaign against the Wends as part of the Crusade, granting the same indulgences to those who fought in the north as to those who went east. The campaign, which began in the summer of 1147, was conducted primarily by the Saxon nobility and their Danish and Polish allies. The forces involved were substantial, though estimates of their size vary. The campaign was divided into roughly two theatres, a western force operating against the Obotrites and other Wendish peoples near the Baltic coast, and an eastern force operating against the Pomeranians. The western campaign was commanded by a coalition of German nobles, including Henry the Lion of the Welf dynasty. Its principal target was the city of Dobbin, a Wendish stronghold, which was besieged. The siege was ultimately unsuccessful in terms of capturing the city, but the Obotrite prince Niklot submitted, converted to Christianity, and agreed to pay tribute, which was presented as a kind of success even if it was mostly a political arrangement, rather than a genuine military or religious victory. The Eastern campaign was more complicated. It was directed against the Pomeranian people, who were already largely Christian, which created an immediate theological awkwardness. You cannot crusade against Christians to convert them to Christianity. The campaign's rationale shifted to something about enforcing proper Christian practice and submission to ecclesiastical authority, which was not very convincing but was the best explanation available. What is striking about the Wendish Crusade is how clearly the stated religious objectives were subordinate to the political ones. The Saxon nobility were interested in expanding their territorial control eastward, into the fertile lands beyond the Elbe. The crusading framework provided a theological justification for this expansion. The result was a campaign that mixed genuine religious motivation on the part of some participants with naked territorial ambition on the part of others. The campaign did not achieve the decisive results that had been hoped for. The Wendish peoples were not permanently crushed or converted. Their resistance continued for decades afterward. But the Wendish Crusade established a precedent that would be enormously important. It established that crusading violence could be directed against non-Muslim enemies of Christendom, and specifically that it could be applied to the pagan frontier peoples of northern and northeastern Europe. This precedent would eventually lead to the Northern Crusades of the 13th century, the campaigns of the Teutonic Knights in Prussia and the Baltic states, and the whole complex of conquest and conversion that transformed the northeastern European frontier over the following 2 centuries. The Wendish Crusade was simultaneously less successful in its immediate objectives than its organisers hoped, and more consequential in its long-term implications than most of them anticipated. It was a small tributary that fed into a much larger river of history. Aftermath. What the Second Crusade actually achieved. When the crusading kings returned to their kingdoms in 1148 and 1149, they arrived to find that their absence had not improved the political situations they had left behind. This was entirely predictable, but was apparently still somewhat surprising to the kings in question. Conrad returned through Constantinople, where his interactions with Manuel I Komnenos were complicated by the Norman attacks on Byzantine territory that had taken place during the Crusade. He arrived in Germany to find the wealth conflict still unresolved and his authority somewhat diminished by the evident failure of his military expedition. He had left as a king going to fight for God. He returned as a king who had lost his army in Anatolia and then failed to take Damascus. The political capital that he had hoped the crusade would earn him was not available. The credibility deficit that the failure had created was immediately apparent. Louis returned to France to find his marriage effectively dead and his political rivals emboldened by his long absence. He had been gone for more than 2 years, and during that time his kingdom had been managed by Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, a capable administrator but not a king. The return to governance after such an absence required adjustments, and the personal atmosphere of the court was poisoned by the tensions that had developed during the campaign. The blame game that followed the Crusade's failure was immediate, vigorous, and enormously revealing about how medieval people processed collective failure. Bernard of Clairvaux, the man who had arguably done more than anyone else to bring the Crusade into being, was placed in a deeply uncomfortable position. He had stood before crowds across Europe and told them that this crusade was God's will. He had used his enormous moral authority to persuade 2 kings to undertake it. He had assured people that success was certain because God was on their side, and the crusade had failed spectacularly. His response was a fascinating document, a passage in his work De Consideratione addressed to Pope Eugenius III, in which he wrestled with the theological implications of the failure. How could a crusade that had been God's will end in such disaster? Bernard's answer was that the sins of the Crusaders themselves had caused God to withdraw his support. The Crusaders had not been pure enough, devoted enough, morally worthy of the victory they had been promised. The failure was not a failure of divine will, but a failure of human virtue. This was a theologically defensible position, and it was not one Bernard had invented for the occasion. It had precedent in the Old Testament, where God repeatedly withdrew his support from the Israelites when they sinned. But it was also a position that was suspiciously convenient for Bernard personally, because it explained the failure without requiring him to take any responsibility for having encouraged people to undertake something that turned out to be catastrophically mismanaged. Others were less charitable. John of Salisbury, that careful observer of events who had been present at Antioch during the Eleanor episode, wrote about the crusade with a mixture of sorrow and barely suppressed frustration. The failure had been enormous. The waste of life and resources had been enormous. The diplomatic consequences were severe. The recriminations extended beyond theological explanation into political accusation. The Byzantines were blamed. Manuel Komnenos' insufficient support, alleged treachery and secret dealings with the Turks became a staple of Western criticism. The evidence for active Byzantine treachery is thin, but the accusations were passionately felt. The relationship between Constantinople and the Western crusading movement, never warm, grew considerably colder. The local lords of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were blamed for the Damascus fiasco. The theories about bribery and deliberate sabotage circulated in Western courts long after the crusade ended. The idea that the Poulains, the locally born Franks, had somehow betrayed the crusade became a convenient explanation for what was actually a collective failure of strategic judgment. Louis and Conrad blamed each other, with the delicacy appropriate to kings who needed to maintain the appearance of Christian brotherhood while feeling distinctly unhappy about their shared experience. The financial cost of the crusade had been staggering. Both kings had borrowed heavily, promised large sums, and liquidated assets to fund the enterprise. The repayment of these debts and the restoration of royal finances occupied administrators for years afterward. The monasteries and churches that had received grants and privileges in exchange for financial support were diligent in claiming what they had been promised. The human cost was harder to calculate but could be felt everywhere. Every family that had sent a man on the crusade and not gotten him back. Every village from which men had departed and not returned. The death toll from battle, from the march across Anatolia, from disease, from the various disasters of the campaign, ran into the tens of thousands. These were not nameless abstractions. They were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. The theological crisis was real too, even if it was processed differently by different people. The First Crusade had been a miracle. Its success had seemed to prove that God actively intervened in human affairs on behalf of the crusading enterprise. The failure of the Second Crusade complicated that narrative in ways that serious thinkers could not simply paper over. Bernard tried to paper over it and largely succeeded in the short term but at the cost of an explanation that would prove insufficient when applied to subsequent crusading failures. What had the Second Crusade actually achieved? In the Holy Land, nothing. The situation was worse than before the Crusade. Edessa remained lost. Damascus had been alienated and driven toward Nur ad-Din. The strategic position of the Crusader states had deteriorated. The only concrete positive outcome in the East was the demonstration, however painful, of exactly which military tactics did and did not work against Turkish cavalry in Anatolia, lessons that subsequent crusaders would apply with varying degrees of success. In Iberia, significant gains. Lisbon, Tortosa, Lerida, and several other cities had been taken. Portuguese territory had expanded substantially. The Reconquista had made real progress. In northeastern Europe, ambiguous outcomes that would prove historically significant in ways their participants had not fully anticipated. The balance sheet was not entirely blank. But measured against the ambitions with which the crusade had begun, measured against the rhetoric of Bernard's sermons and the dreams of the departing armies, the failure was overwhelming. Nur ad-Din and the Muslim world. The other side of the story. We have been telling this story primarily from the Crusader perspective, as the sources require us to do, because the Christian sources are vastly more abundant for this period than the Muslim ones. But the Second Crusade did not happen only to the Crusaders. It happened in a Muslim world that had its own politics, its own theological debates, its own military strategies, and its own understanding of what the Crusaders represented and how to deal with them. The key figure in the Muslim world during the Second Crusade was Nur ad-Din Mahmud, the son of Zengi, who had inherited his father's power in Aleppo and Mosul in 1146. If his father Zengi had been primarily a political and military opportunist who used the language of jihad when it suited him, Nur ad-Din was something genuinely different. He was a man of serious religious conviction, who understood the jihad not merely as a useful slogan, but as a genuine moral and religious obligation. Nur ad-Din was, by the accounts of his contemporaries, including Western ones, an impressive figure. He was known for his personal piety, his ascetic lifestyle, his careful observance of Islamic law. He gave generously to religious scholars and institutions. He was genuinely popular with his subjects in a way that his father, for all his military genius, had never been. Where Zengi had ruled by fear, Nur ad-Din ruled by a combination of authority and genuine respect. He was also deeply intelligent about the long-term strategic situation. He understood that the Crusader states were not going to be defeated in a single battle. They were going to be gradually isolated, their alliances with neighbouring Muslim powers broken, their diplomatic options narrowed, until they stood alone against a unified Muslim world that could overwhelm them through sheer weight of sustained pressure. The Second Crusade, from Nur ad-Din's perspective, was simultaneously a threat and an opportunity. The arrival of two royal armies in the Holy Land was genuinely alarming. The combined forces of France, Germany and the Crusader states, if properly coordinated and well led, represented a military capacity that could cause significant damage. The smart strategic response was exactly what Nur ad-Din did: move quickly to relieve Damascus and prevent the city from falling to the Crusaders. But the Crusaders' decision to attack Damascus, and then to abandon the siege, was an almost miraculous gift. It handed Nur ad-Din exactly what he needed. Damascus, driven to seek his protection, moved into his orbit. The buffer between the northern Muslim powers and the Kingdom of Jerusalem began to dissolve. Nur ad-Din absorbed Damascus formally in 1154, 6 years after the failed siege. The transition was smooth, because the groundwork had been laid by the Crusaders themselves. By attacking Damascus and then failing to take it, they had demonstrated to the Damascene leadership that the Kingdom of Jerusalem could not be trusted and could not be depended upon for protection. Nur ad-Din, by contrast, had come to their rescue. The alignment of interests was clear. With Damascus under his control, Nur ad-Din now effectively controlled a continuous territory, stretching from Mosul in northern Iraq through Aleppo and down to Damascus. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was surrounded on 3 sides. The sea remained open to the west, but the land frontiers were now uniformly hostile. The Muslim sources of this period also record Nur ad-Din's deliberate effort to construct a religious and ideological framework for the jihad against the Crusaders. He commissioned religious literature, sponsored scholars who wrote about the obligations of jihad, had coins and inscriptions made that emphasized his role as the defender of Islam against the Frankish invaders. He was building not just a military empire but a religious narrative, positioning himself as the champion of Sunni Islam against both the Frankish Crusaders and the Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. This ideological construction was not purely cynical. Nur ad-Din genuinely believed it. But he also understood that belief needed institutional support, that ideas needed to be embedded in institutions and texts and material culture to become politically effective. He was as careful about the propaganda of his rule as he was about its military and administrative dimensions. The Second Crusade, in the Muslim historical consciousness, is primarily significant for what it did not achieve. It did not retake Edessa. It did not weaken Nur ad-Din. It did not split the Muslim world or reverse the strategic gains that Zengi had made at Edessa, and its failure created the conditions in which Nur ad-Din could consolidate his power and begin preparing the ground for the next phase of the conflict. That next phase would centre on Egypt, the last independent Muslim power in the region. Control of Egypt would give whoever held it the resources and the strategic depth to overwhelm the Crusader States. Nur ad-Din understood this, and he began manoeuvring toward it. The story of how Egypt was eventually brought under the control of his forces, and the role that a young Kurdish general named Saladin played in that process, is the next chapter of the crusading story. But it begins here, in the diplomatic and military space that the Second Crusade created and then failed to fill. The Muslim scholars and historians who wrote about the Second Crusade in the years and decades following it saw it as a confirmation of what some of them had been arguing for years. The Crusaders were not invincible. Their armies could be defeated in the field. Their sieges could be broken. Their alliances with neighbouring Muslim powers could be disrupted. The memory of Zengi's victory at Edessa and the failed crusade that followed it became part of the ideological fuel that powered the jihad movement for the next generation. Ibn al-Qalanisi, a Damascene chronicler who lived through the siege of Damascus and recorded it, describes the arrival and withdrawal of the crusading army with a mixture of relief and contempt. The Franks had come with great armies, he wrote, and they had gone away with nothing. The city had been preserved, God had protected it. The narrative he constructed was one of divine protection of the Muslim world against the foreign invader, a mirror image of the Christian narrative that God had failed the Crusaders because of their sins. Both narratives were doing the same thing. Both were using theological language to explain events that were in reality the products of specific decisions, specific miscalculations and specific failures of military and political judgment. But both were also genuinely felt by the people who constructed them, and both would shape the behaviour of their respective communities in the decades to come. Eleanor of Aquitaine, history's most unfairly blamed woman. Let us step back from the grand sweep of military and political history for a moment, and spend some time with the figure who, in the popular imagination, has become almost as central to the Second Crusade as the kings who led it. Eleanor of Aquitaine has been simultaneously one of the most celebrated and most maligned women in medieval history, and the Second Crusade is the moment at which her reputation first acquired the dark colouring that would follow it for centuries. The accusation, at its most basic, is that Eleanor had an affair with her uncle Raymond of Antioch during the Crusade. The more extreme version suggests that she was having affairs throughout the campaign, that she was a sexually voracious woman whose behaviour embarrassed her husband and damaged the crusade. The most extreme version suggests that she was conspiring politically against Louis, that she was the cause of the break between the French and Antiochian policy that cost the crusade so much. Let us look at what the sources actually say, which requires us first to look at when the sources were written and who wrote them. The most lurid account of Eleanor's behaviour at Antioch comes from John of Salisbury's Historia Pontificalis, a work written in the 1160s, roughly 15 years after the events. John was a careful observer who was actually present at Antioch during the Crusade, which gives him a kind of authority. What he says is that Eleanor told Louis she wished to remain in Antioch, that she raised the question of their consanguinity as grounds for dissolving the marriage, and that Louis had her removed by force. He does not say she had an affair with Raymond. He says she wanted to stay. The reasons he gives are that she was fond of her uncle, and that she had theological and legal concerns about her marriage. The more explicit affair allegations come later. The chronicler William of Tyre, writing his great history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1170s, several decades after the Crusade, reports that Eleanor's relationship with Raymond was the subject of rumours at the time, and that those rumours spoke of excessive familiarity between the Queen and her uncle. He frames this as reported rumour, not established fact, and he is writing at a distance of 30 years from the events. John of Salisbury, as we noted, was actually there. He says nothing about an affair. This is significant. The most scandalous account comes from later still, from the chronicler Richard of Devizes, writing in the 1190s, who says frankly that Eleanor behaved improperly at Antioch. But Richard of Devizes was writing 50 years after the events, was not present, and was writing in a context where Eleanor's reputation had already been damaged by decades of hostile commentary. The pattern is clear. The closer to the events in time, the less explicit the allegations. The further from the events, the more the story grows. This is the fingerprint of legend in the making. What can we say with reasonable confidence? Eleanor was unhappy at Antioch, or at least unhappy at leaving it. She had genuine legal concerns about her marriage, concerns that she would raise again after the Crusade, and that would eventually be resolved in an annulment in 1152. She found her uncle's company more congenial than the atmosphere of Louis's court. Louis found her behaviour at Antioch mortifying and personally threatening. Did she have an affair with Raymond? We cannot prove that she did not, which is not the same as proving that she did. What we can say is that the primary evidence for the affair does not exist in the contemporary sources. What exists is a story that grew over time, shaped by the needs of those who are interested in discrediting Eleanor, and by the irresistible drama of the narrative. Eleanor was a woman who did not fit comfortably into the expectations that 12th century society had for queens. She was forceful, opinionated, politically active, unwilling to subordinate herself entirely to her husband's will. She outlived most of her contemporaries, eventually becoming the mother of Richard I of England and playing a major political role in the 1190s. She was impossible to ignore and extremely difficult to control, and the medieval chroniclers, who were predominantly male clergy with rather firm views about the proper place of women in the social order, found her presence in the historical record deeply uncomfortable. The affair story served a purpose. It explained Louis's failure at Antioch in terms of his wife's behaviour, rather than his own poor judgment. It diminished Eleanor's political significance by reducing her to a sexually transgressive woman, rather than a politically significant actor. It fit into a long tradition of misogynistic historical writing that attributed male failures to female wickedness. None of which means that Eleanor was a saint. She was a medieval noblewoman of enormous power and ambition, and she made decisions throughout her long life that were sometimes ruthless, sometimes mistaken, and sometimes brilliant. But the specific charges that attached to the Second Crusade, the affair with Raymond, the scandalous behaviour at Antioch, rest on very thin evidential ground when you actually look at the sources carefully. What we can say is that Eleanor's presence on the Crusade and her behaviour at Antioch were politically significant. They contributed to the breakdown of the Louis-Raymond relationship and to the French refusal to cooperate with Raymond's military strategy, which was arguably one of the Second Crusade's more consequential mistakes. But these were political consequences, not moral ones, and Eleanor's role in them was the role of a politically active, determined woman pursuing her own interests and convictions in a situation where those interests happened to conflict with her husband's. Eleanor of Aquitaine deserves to be understood as a historical figure in her own right, not as a convenient explanation for male failures. The Second Crusade does not require her affair with Raymond to explain why it failed. It failed because of decisions made by men in councils and on battlefields. Eleanor's role in those failures is the role of a person present in the story, not its author. Her later life, the divorce from Louis, the marriage to Henry II, the court at Poitiers that became a centre of medieval culture, the political role she played in the Angevin Empire, the extraordinary longevity that kept her active and influential into her 80s, all of that belongs to other stories. But those other stories are shaped partly by the reputation she acquired during the Second Crusade, a reputation that was built more on misogyny and convenience than on evidence. The legacy, what the Second Crusade changed forever. The Second Crusade ended in 1149 as a military and political failure that no amount of theological explanation could entirely obscure. The armies went home, the kings made their peace with defeat, or tried to. The Pope issued letters, the theologians wrote their treatises, and the world continued turning. But the Second Crusade's legacy was not simply the legacy of a failure. It was more complex than that, more layered, more consequential in ways that its immediate aftermath could not fully reveal. Let us begin with what it changed in the Crusader states themselves. The most immediate and concrete consequence was the loss of Damascus's neutrality. We have already discussed this, but it is worth re-emphasizing because its long-term implications were so severe. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had spent decades cultivating a relationship with Damascus that kept the city from aligning fully with the Muslim powers to the north. The Second Crusade destroyed that relationship in 4 days of catastrophic strategic miscalculation. When Nur ad-Din absorbed Damascus in 1154, the northern buffer was gone. Jerusalem now faced a unified Muslim state that stretched from the Euphrates to the anti-Lebanon mountains. The countdown to the great catastrophe of 1187, when Saladin destroyed the crusading army at the Battle of Hattin and retook Jerusalem, had effectively begun. The Second Crusade also changed the internal politics of the Crusader States in ways that proved damaging. The relationship between the local nobility of Outremer and the visiting crusaders from the west was poisoned by the Damascus fiasco. The local lords blamed the kings for the decision, or the kings blamed the local lords, depending on which source you read. Neither group trusted the other fully afterward. This mutual suspicion made future coordination between visiting crusaders and the resident nobility of the Holy Land more difficult, a problem that would recur in subsequent crusades. The military orders emerged from the Second Crusade with enhanced prestige. The Templars in particular had distinguished themselves during the march through Anatolia, providing the disciplined rearguard that had saved the French army from worse losses than it actually suffered. Their reputation for military professionalism was strengthened. Their appeal to potential recruits and donors in the West was increased. The failure of the Crusade, paradoxically, contributed to the growth of the military orders by demonstrating that the Holy Land needed permanent professional defenders rather than occasional enthusiastic amateurs. In Europe, the Second Crusade changed the theology of crusading in important ways. The failure forced serious thinkers to revisit the question of what a crusade actually was, and what guarantees, if any, God had made about its outcome. The confident theology of Urban II's preaching, in which the crusade was God's will and its success therefore assured, had already been complicated by the difficulties the Crusaders had experienced even during the successful First Crusade. The Second Crusade made those complications acute. Bernard of Clairvaux's explanation that the Crusaders' sins had caused God to withdraw support established a template that would be used again and again to explain crusading failures in the following centuries. It was a template that served the institutional interest of crusading ideology by making the failure the fault of the Crusaders rather than of the enterprise itself. If the crusade failed because the Crusaders were insufficiently virtuous, then the answer was not to stop crusading but to crusade better, more devoutly, with greater purity of heart and purpose. This argument was influential but not universally persuasive. It required a degree of theological flexibility that some thinkers found uncomfortable. It also created a treadmill dynamic in which each crusade's failure could be attributed to the moral failures of its participants, which meant that no failure could ever definitively discredit the crusading project itself. This was excellent news for the crusading ideology, and rather bad news for the tens of thousands of people who kept dying in pursuit of it. The Second Crusade also had a significant impact on the papacy's relationship with crusading. Eugenius III had thrown his full authority behind the enterprise, appointing Bernard as preacher, issuing bulls, attending departure ceremonies, lending the full weight of the papal office to the mobilization. The failure reflected on that authority, not devastatingly but measurably. Subsequent popes were perhaps somewhat more cautious about guaranteeing specific outcomes in their crusading appeals, though the institution's commitment to crusading as a concept remained firm. The expansion of the crusading concept to include Iberia and northeastern Europe was perhaps the Second Crusade's most consequential long-term contribution. By explicitly framing the Reconquista and the Wendish Crusade as legitimate components of the crusading enterprise, Eugenius III and Bernard had dramatically expanded the scope of what crusading meant. It was no longer primarily a response to a specific threat in a specific place. It was a general framework for Christian holy war that could be applied wherever the enemies of Christendom were found. This expansion had profound consequences. The Northern Crusades of the 13th century, which transformed the Baltic region and established the Teutonic Knights as a major power in northeastern Europe, grew directly from the precedents established by the Wendish Crusade of 1147. The continued papal involvement in the Iberian Reconquista throughout the 12th and 13th centuries was supported by the framework established during the Second Crusade. The capture of Lisbon established Portugal as a viable kingdom and contributed to the eventual Portuguese maritime expansion of the 15th and 16th centuries, which would in turn transform the entire world. It is not too much to say that the Portuguese Empire, and through it the modern map of Africa and the Americas, has one of its roots in the crusading fleet that stopped at Oporto in 1147. In the Muslim world, the Second Crusade accelerated the consolidation of power that would eventually produce Saladin. Nur ad-Din spent the years following the Crusade systematically expanding his control, bringing Damascus under his authority, pressing against the frontiers of the Crusader States, building the unified Muslim state that his successor would use to retake Jerusalem. Every year that passed after 1148 saw the strategic position of the Crusader states deteriorate relative to the Muslim world. The road from the failed siege of Damascus in 1148 to Saladin's triumph at Hattin in 1187 was not straight, and it was not inevitable. There were moments along the way when the Crusaders came close to stabilizing their position, when strong leadership and favorable circumstances gave them windows of opportunity. But the underlying dynamic was one of Muslim consolidation and Christian fragmentation, and the Second Crusade had done nothing to reverse that dynamic and a great deal to accelerate it. What does the Second Crusade tell us about the medieval world that produced it? It tells us that religious faith and military failure were not incompatible. The Crusaders who marched from Europe in 1147 were genuinely, deeply faithful people. Their motivation was not purely political or economic. They were taking real risks, spending real money, leaving real lives and families because they believed genuinely that God was calling them to do this. Their faith did not protect them from making bad decisions, from underestimating their enemies, from political miscalculation, from the physical realities of disease and climate and supply. It was never going to protect them from those things. It tells us that political interests and religious ideals were always entangled in the crusading movement, sometimes in ways that the participants themselves recognized, and sometimes in ways they did not. Louis went on crusade partly for genuine piety, and partly to atone for the Vitry catastrophe, and partly for the political prestige it might bring. Conrad went partly because Bernard talked him into it, and partly because of the papal favour and political advantages that crusading status conferred. Afonso of Portugal used crusaders to take Lisbon and expand his kingdom. The Saxon nobility used the crusading framework to pursue their territorial ambitions against the Wends. None of these motivations were purely cynical, and none of them were purely pure. It tells us about the limitations of medieval military planning. The Second Crusade was, in many ways, better organised than the First. There was clearer leadership. There was more advanced coordination. There were better arrangements for supply and transit. And it was still a catastrophic failure, partly because the military and logistical challenges were enormous and the information available to commanders was inadequate, and partly because the decision-making at critical moments was poor. It tells us about the complexity of interfaith relations in the medieval Mediterranean. The Crusaders attacked Damascus, their occasional diplomatic partner, while their Byzantine allies provided inadequate support and possibly active obstruction. The Damascene rulers called on Nur ad-Din for help, while trading with the very Crusaders who were trying to take their city. The political and economic relationships of the medieval Middle East did not map neatly onto the binary religious framework that crusading ideology tried to impose on them, and it tells us something about the human capacity for self-justification. The Second Crusade was a failure of enormous proportions, and almost nobody who had been involved in bringing it about took personal responsibility for that failure. Bernard blamed the Crusaders' sins. Louis blamed the Byzantines and the local lords of Jerusalem. Conrad blamed the local lords and the Byzantines and probably Louis. The local lords blamed the kings. The kings blamed each other. The theologians blamed everyone's collective moral inadequacy. Nobody said, simply and honestly, we planned this badly. We made poor strategic decisions. We miscalculated the military situation, and we paid for those mistakes with tens of thousands of lives. That kind of institutional honesty was not particularly common in the 12th century. It is not particularly common in any century. The Second Crusade was neither the beginning nor the end of the crusading movement. It was a moment in the middle of a long, complex story that had no clean chapter breaks and no simple moral lessons. It was a moment when the grandest ambitions of medieval Christendom collided with the realities of geography, politics, and military power, and the realities won. The armies marched home. The Holy Land remained contested. Jerusalem remained Christian for another 40 years, and the Muslim world, strengthened and emboldened by the Crusade's failure, continued its steady march toward the day when Saladin would ride through the gates of Jerusalem and the whole thing would have to start over again. Good evening, and we have travelled a long way tonight. From the clay of the Anatolian plateau where Conrad's army was broken, to the orchards of Damascus where a campaign that should never have been attempted was abandoned, to the walls of Lisbon where the Crusade actually achieved something worth celebrating, to the theological wrestling of Bernard of Clairvaux trying to explain why God had let everyone down. The Second Crusade is a story about ambition and failure, about the gap between what people believe they're doing and what they are actually doing, about the way that good intentions and bad strategy can combine to produce catastrophe. It is also, in its Iberian chapter, a story about opportunism and success, about what happens when crusading energy gets directed at achievable goals rather than symbolic ones. And it is a story about people, about Louis VII, the reluctant king who was too pious for his own political good, about Conrad III, who was talked into a foreign adventure and paid for it with his army, about Bernard of Clairvaux, the most effective orator of the age, whose rhetorical triumph at Vézelay led directly to the disaster in the east, about Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose presence on the crusade made her a lightning rod for blame that was only partly deserved, about Nur ad-Din, who watched the crusade from the other side and understood exactly what it meant for his ambitions, about the nameless thousands who marched and died and were remembered by nobody except perhaps the people who loved them. History does not always reward virtue. The Crusaders of 1147 were no more sinful, probably, than the Crusaders of 1097 who had succeeded. The Second Crusade failed not because the people who went on it were worse people than their predecessors, but because the circumstances were different, the enemy was better prepared, and the decisions made along the way were catastrophically poor. That's a more uncomfortable explanation than Bernard's theory about divine punishment for sin. It requires us to accept that good people can do terrible things not from evil, but from miscalculation, that faith does not substitute for strategic judgment, and that the universe does not arrange itself to reward sincerity, but it is the honest explanation. And the Second Crusade, for all its failure, deserves at least that. Wherever you are listening from tonight, in whatever corner of the world, whatever the hour, I hope this journey through one of history's great failures has given you something to think about in the quiet of the night. The Second Crusade happened. The people who went on it were real. Their faith was real. Their suffering was real. And the world that came after it was shaped, in ways both large and small, by what they did and what they failed to do. The lights are going down now. The history is settling. Let it rest quietly alongside you as you drift towards sleep. We will be back with more journeys into the past. But for now, good night.